Before we dive into this chilling story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more real and spine-tingling accounts to life. The sequoias were my cathedral, their towering forms stretching endlessly into the sky. The air was crisp, cool enough to make me grateful for my jacket, and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. For as long as I could remember, I had found solace in this forest, its quiet majesty, its unwavering permanence. But lately, the silence felt heavier, the shadows between the trunks darker. I told myself it was just the time of year. Autumn did strange things to the light. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. It had been a routine day at the station, a typical mix of paperwork, radio chatter, and the occasional hiker stopping by for a map or a refill on water. Around mid-afternoon, the shift had settled into its predictable rhythm. I sipped my coffee, black and lukewarm, and stared out the window at the golden light filtering through the trees. For a moment, I felt the ache in my shoulder where an old injury liked to remind me it existed. That injury was one of the many scars left behind by a failed search and rescue mission 2 years ago. The boy I couldn't save. The weight of his name lingered in my memory like a shadow that never faded. I didn't hear them approach at first. The door burst open, and I nearly spilled my coffee. A man and woman, both in their early 40s, stumbled inside, their faces pale and stricken. Behind them, a teenage girl clutched her arms tightly to her chest, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The man's voice cracked as he said, "Please, you have to help us. He's missing." I set my coffee down and stepped forward, hands instinctively going to my belt where my radio and flashlight hung. "Take a breath," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Tell me what happened." The man swallowed hard, his chest heaving as though he'd just run a marathon. "It's our son, Ethan. He's 8. We were hiking the Morrow Rock Trail, and he just disappeared." "Disappeared?" I repeated, trying to clarify. "Did he wander off? Was there an accident?" The woman's voice trembled. "We don't know. He was right behind us 1 second, and the next gone." Her eyes filled with tears, and she clutched her husband's arm, as if to steady herself. The teenage girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I heard him laugh, like he was playing, but it didn't sound like him." A chill ran down my spine. I masked it with a practiced nod and gestured for them to sit down. "Let me get some details. What time did you last see him?" The father checked his watch, though his hands were shaking. "Around field. It's been almost an hour." "Okay," I said, mentally calculating how far an 8-year-old could wander in 60 minutes. "Not far, I hoped. Did he have a backpack? A whistle? Anything bright on him?" "No backpack. No whistle," the father admitted, his voice cracking with guilt. "But he's wearing a red jacket." "Good," I thought. Bright colors were easier to spot, even as the light started to fade. "Stay here," I instructed, already moving toward the back room to grab my gear. "I'll call for backup and get a search going." As I packed my essentials, a map, flashlight, first aid kit, and a GPS unit, I couldn't ignore the faint prickle of unease that had begun crawling up my neck. I'd been on searches before, plenty of them. Most ended fine. But this one already felt wrong. Back in the main room, I handed the family bottles of water and told them to stay put. "Ranger Lopez will stay with you," I said, motioning to my colleague who had just arrived. I'll call you the moment I find anything. The father grabbed my arm. Please, just bring him back, he said, his voice raw with desperation. His grip was tight, and I could feel his fear like a physical weight pressing down on both of us. I will, I promised. I didn't know if I believed it, but I said it anyway. The forest greeted me like an old friend when I stepped outside, but this time, its embrace felt colder. The sun was sinking fast, its golden light slanting through the trees and casting long shadows that danced as the wind rustled the leaves. I radioed in the missing child report to dispatch, gave them Ethan's description, and requested additional search teams. They promised to send help, but I knew it might be a while before anyone else arrived. That meant the first steps fell to me. I started down the Morro Rock Trail, scanning for any sign of Ethan, a scrap of clothing, a footprint, anything. My boots crunched on the gravel path, the sound unnaturally loud in the thickening silence. Every few steps, I called his name. Ethan! Ethan, it's Ranger Jones. If you can hear me, shout back. Nothing. Just the rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a raven. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trail narrowed, and the ancient sequoias loomed taller, their branches intertwining to block out what little sunlight remained. The world seemed to shrink, the weight of the trees pressing in on me. My flashlight cut through the growing shadows, but the beam felt weak against the sheer vastness of the forest. The unease in my chest tightened. I told myself it was just the light, the quiet, the pressure of finding Ethan before nightfall. But part of me, an instinct I couldn't shake, felt like the forest was watching, waiting. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and pushed forward. The boy couldn't have gone far. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The family's panic was palpable, filling the air of the ranger station like static electricity. The father, a wiry man with glasses slipping down his nose, clutched a map of the hiking trail in trembling hands. The mother stood beside him, holding their younger daughter close to her chest, as if the girl might vanish too if she let go. Their voices overlapped, frantic and desperate, making it hard to untangle the details at first. I raised my hand, signaling for calm, though my own heart was starting to hammer in my chest. Take a deep breath, I said, meeting the father's wide-eyed gaze. What have you started from the beginning? Where were you when you last saw Ethan? The father nodded quickly, gulping down air as if it might steady him. We were on the giant forest loop, he said, his voice cracking. Ethan, Key's aide, Key was walking ahead of us, just a few feet. We stopped to take a picture by the fallen monarch, and when we turned back, Key was gone. Gone? I repeated, leaning forward. Did you hear anything? See where you went? The man shook his head violently, his hands clutching the mat tighter. Nothing. Just silence. Then, maybe a minute later, we heard him laughing. It was faint, like he was coming from further up the trail, but when we called for him, his words broke off, and his wife continued for him. He didn't answer, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It sounded like he was playing, like hide and seek, but we couldn't find him. We looked for an hour before coming here. I glanced at the clock. Twilight was about 30 minutes away. The forest wasn't forgiving after dark. The thought of an 8-year-old alone out there, with the temperature already dropping, made my stomach twist. Okay, I said, keeping my tone calm for their sake. I'll head out right now. We'll find him. The father opened his mouth, but I cut him off gently. You need to stay here, I said firmly. If Ethan circles back, someone needs to be here to meet him. Plus, I need you rested in case this takes longer than expected." The mother nodded reluctantly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please," she said, her voice cracking, "just bring him back. He's scared of the dark." I grabbed my gear, a flashlight, radio, and a map of the park trails. I also stuffed a thermal blanket and first aid kit into my pack just in case. As I stepped out of the station, the setting sun cast long, golden beams through the tops of the sequoias. The beauty of the scene was jarring against the urgency of the situation, as if the forest itself was indifferent to the plight of the missing boy. I found the family's trail easily. The soft dirt of the giant forest loop was crisscrossed with footprints, most of them from hikers earlier in the day. But soon enough, I spotted a smaller set, Ethan's, judging by the size. They veered slightly off the main path, heading toward a cluster of trees that stood like ancient sentinels. The tracks weren't deep, but they were deliberate. He'd been walking, not running. That was a good sign, or so I told myself. I followed the trail until it faded, swallowed up by a patch of pine needles. The fading light made it harder to see, and I flicked on my flashlight, the beam slicing through the dimness. That's when I spotted the water bottle. It was lying on its side beneath the thick fern, the bright blue plastic catching the light. I knelt down to inspect it. The label was torn, the plastic scratched, as if it had been dropped or dragged. "Ethan," I called, my voice carrying through the trees. The forest swallowed the sound, offering nothing in return. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my pulse quickening. Something about the silence was wrong. I'd spent years in these woods, and I knew the sounds of the forest, wind in the trees, the rustle of animals in the underbrush. But now, it was like the entire forest was holding its breath. I stood and called again, louder this time. "Ethan, it's Ranger Kevin. If you can hear me, call out." Nothing. Just the soft crunch of my boots as I pressed on. The trail seemed to lead toward a denser part of the forest, where the trees grew closer together and the underbrush thickened. I radioed back to the station, giving my position and letting them know I'd found Ethan's water bottle. "Any signs of him yet?" asked Carol, the ranger on duty. "Not yet," I replied, "but I'm following a lead. Stay on the line." I kept moving, my flashlight beam darting over the terrain. The trail was faint now, little more than a suggestion of where Ethan might have gone. My thoughts raced. Why would an 8-year-old wander this far off the main path? And what was with the silence? I paused to catch my breath, listening intently. For a moment, I thought I heard something, soft laughter, distant and faint, like a child playing a game. My heart leapt, but the sound was gone as quickly as it came, leaving me with nothing but the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood there, the flashlight heavy in my hand, as a cold knot of unease tightened in my chest. Something wasn't right. "Ethan," I called again, my voice cutting through the stillness. "If you're there, say something." Only the silence replied. The forest was different at twilight. There was something about the way the shadows stretched, as if the trees themselves were leaning forward, conspiring to block out the last slivers of daylight. I tightened the straps on my backpack and pressed forward, keeping my focus on the faint trail of footprints in the damp soil. They were small, erratic, clearly Ethan's. The thought of an 8-year-old wandering alone out here turned my stomach, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panic didn't save lives. Methodical searching did. I'd been in Sequoia National Park for almost a decade, knew it like the back of my hand, or so I thought. Tonight, though, it felt like I was walking into unfamiliar territory. The towering sequoias stood like silent sentinels, their massive trunks glowing faintly red in the dimming light. Normally, the sight of them inspired a kind of reverence, but now, with night creeping in, they seemed oppressive, their gnarled roots clawing at the earth like they wanted to pull me under. I paused for a moment and scanned the area with my flashlight. The beam cut through the underbrush, picking out flashes of ferns and low-hanging branches. I called out, "Ethan! Ethan, can you hear me?" My voice echoed briefly, swallowed up by the dense canopy. No response. Just a deafening silence, then it started to settle in. A silence so complete it felt wrong. The forest wasn't usually like this. At this time of day, you'd expect to hear the rustle of squirrels or the soft flutter of birds settling into their nests. Instead, there was nothing. Just my own breathing and the crunch of my boots against the ground. I moved forward, my flashlight's beam bouncing across the trail. The footprints veered off to the right, away from the marked path and into denser woods. Great. Of course. I cursed under my breath and followed, ducking under low-hanging branches. The further I went, the more the air seemed to change. It was subtle at first, a faint chill that didn't match the season. Then came the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was distinct, damp breath, mixed with something metallic, almost like rust. It wasn't unusual for the forest to have strange odors now and then, but this smelled wrong. Like decay, but muted, just enough to make you second-guess whether you were really smelling it at all. The trees seemed closer together now, their massive trunks forming an almost impenetrable wall. My radio crackled to life suddenly, startling me. It was Mark back at the station. "Kevin, any sign of the kid?" I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. "Not yet. I've got a trail, but it's leading off path. I'm going to keep following it. Might take me a while." Mark's voice came back, laced with concern. "Copy that. Be careful out there. Sun's almost gone." "Yeah, I noticed," I muttered, clipping the radio back to my vest. As I pushed deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't the usual, "someone might be watching" paranoia. It was something else entirely. The kind of feeling that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, like an instinct buried deep in your DNA was screaming at you to turn around. I stopped again, sweeping the flashlight in a wide arc. Something caught my eye, a faint shimmer on the bark of a tree to my left. I stepped closer, squinting. There were scratches on the bark, deep and jagged, as though something with claws had raked across it. But they weren't random. They almost looked deliberate, like they formed a pattern. I traced the marks with my gloved hand, feeling the rough edges. They were fresh. Whatever made them had been here recently. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. It came again, a soft, lilting giggle. High-pitched, like a child's. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. Silence. I turned in a slow circle, shining my light into the underbrush. The sound came again, this time from behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area. The forest felt alive now, as though it was watching me. I clenched my flashlight tighter and forced myself to take a deep breath. This was my job. Stay calm. Stay focused. I called out again, louder this time. "Ethan, if you can hear me, yell back." Nothing. The giggle came again, farther away this time, drifting through the trees like smoke. It sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't sure what unsettled me more, the sound itself or the fact that it didn't seem natural. It was too perfect, too deliberate, like someone mimicking a child's laugh. I pressed on, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The trail was getting harder to follow, the footprints fading into the softer soil. The forest grew darker with every step, the trees pressing in on me like they wanted to swallow me whole. Somewhere deep in the shadows, something moved. It was quick, just a flicker of motion at the edge of my vision. I spun toward it, but all I saw was the swaying of a low-hanging branch. My breathing was shallow now, my senses on high alert. I'd been in this park for years, but tonight it felt like I didn't belong. Like I was an intruder in a place that wasn't meant to be seen after dark. "Ethan," I whispered, more to myself than anything else. "Where are you?" And then, as if an answer, the giggle came again. This time, it was closer. The forest had always been my sanctuary. Even during the most grueling days, its stillness was a balm to my soul. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon and shadows stretched their gnarled fingers across the trail, it felt different. Wrong. The towering sequoias, usually stoic and unwavering, seemed to lean closer, their ancient trunks growing softly in the cooling air. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, listening intently. My headlamp cast a narrow cone of light, barely denting the encroaching darkness. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, heavier than my pack. A silence like that didn't belong here, not in the lively woods, where even the faintest rustle or chirp reminded me I wasn't alone. Then, faintly, I heard it. A laugh. It was high-pitched and faint, carried by the soft, playful tones of a child. My pulse quickened as I spun in the direction it came from. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice firm but laced with hope. The laugh came again, this time closer. It echoed oddly, bouncing off the trees in ways that made pinpointing its source impossible. I swallowed hard, tightening my grip on the radio at my side. "Ethan, it's Kevin. I'm here to help you. Can you call out to me?" Nothing. The air felt thicker now, colder, and the beam of my headlamp seemed feeble against the dark that pulled between the trees. I hesitated. I tracked missing hikers before, followed their shouts or cries, and the relief of hearing them again was always electric. But this didn't feel like relief. The laugh sounded again, closer still. But now, it wasn't just laughter. It had an odd cadence, as though it were mimicking a sound it didn't quite understand. I pushed forward, my boots crunching against the brittle underbrush, the only sound breaking the heavy stillness. "Ethan, keep making noise, buddy," I called, forcing my voice to sound steadier than I felt. The trail twisted sharply, and the undergrowth grew thicker. Branches clawed at my sleeves as I pushed through, my breath puffing out in small clouds. The laugh came again, now from my left. My stomach tightened. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but something about the way the sound seemed to dart and weave didn't add up. It wasn't just the sound, it was the way the forest responded to it. Every time the laugh echoed, the woods seemed to hold their breath, as if bracing for something unseen. I stopped again and flicked the beam of my headlamp across the trees. The light wavered, catching on something, a faint glint of movement deep in the shadows. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, waiting, watching, but it was gone before I could make sense of it. Just the wind, I told myself. or a deer startled by my approach. But I didn't really believe that. "Ethan," I called again, louder this time, my voice bouncing off the trees. This time, there was no laugh, just silence. I stepped forward cautiously, scanning the trail ahead. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, nearly falling. When I steadied myself, I realized the terrain had changed. The well-trodden dirt path had given way to uneven ground, tangled with roots and stones. I couldn't recall the trail ever veering this way. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. My gut screamed that I should turn back, that this wasn't right. But I shoved the thought aside. There was a child out here, lost, alone, or worse. My job wasn't to question the trail. It was to find him. Then I heard it again. This time, it was a laughter. It was a whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible, like the wind brushing through the leaves. But it wasn't the wind. It had words. "Kevin," my breath hitched. It wasn't Ethan's voice. It couldn't be. It sounded older, rougher, yet somehow layered with something wrong. My name didn't sound like my name. I swept my light wildly across the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I barked, my voice cracking. The whisper came again, the same distorted voice calling my name, but now from my right. "Kevin!" Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I clenched my teeth and forced myself to move forward. If this was some cruel trick, I wasn't going to let it stop me. I'd find Ethan, and I'd get us both out of here. The whisper faded, replaced once again by that haunting laughter. My light caught on something ahead, a break in the dense trees. I quickened my pace, stepping into a clearing bathed in a pale, sickly light from the rising moon. The clearing was unnaturally quiet, the air stagnant and heavy. And there, at its center, was something that made my blood run cold. A ring of stones, arranged with meticulous precision. In the middle, a small pile of sticks was stacked in the shape of a crude human figure. The laughter stopped, and for the first time that night, I realized I wasn't just searching for Ethan. Something was searching for me. The forest was darker now, the towering sequoias casting long, impenetrable shadows. My flashlight struggled to cut through the growing gloom, its beam swallowed whole by the trees' massive trunks. The air felt heavier here, almost oppressive, like the weight of the forest itself had decided to settle on my shoulders. Each step I took was accompanied by the crunch of dried leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig, sounds that felt far too loud in the suffocating silence. "Ethan!" I called, my voice ringing out into the void. "If you can hear me, call back." Nothing. No response. Just the stillness of the woods, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind high above. My radio crackled to life briefly. Another ranger checking in. I gave a curt reply, trying to mask the frustration creeping into my voice. Time was running out. Nightfall was closing in, and the last traces of Ethan's footprints were fading with the soft, scattered light. Then I saw it, something small lying at the base of a tree about 20 yards ahead. It stood out in stark contrast against the forest floor, a jarring bit of color amid the browns and greens. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. As I approached, my flashlight illuminated the object, a tiny, blue backpack. It was unzipped, the contents spilling slightly. A juice box, a crumpled wrapper, and a toy car with chipped paint. I knelt down, my fingers brushing against the fabric. It was Ethan's, no question about it. Relief mixed with dread as I examined the bag. Relief because it confirmed I was on the right track. Dread, because of the scratches on the tree beside it. The marks were jagged, uneven, as though something with claws, or something mimicking claws, had raked against the bark. They were fresh. Bits of wood curled at the edges of the gouges, the pale inner layer stark against the darkened bark. They weren't animal tracks. I'd seen enough of those to know better. These marks looked deliberate, almost purposeful. I shined my flashlight upward, scanning the massive trunk for more clues. The light caught on something higher up, a faint smear of what looked like dirt or sap, maybe 5 feet above the ground. It could have been nothing, but it felt like a sign. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had lingered here, watching, waiting. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the faintest sound. It was barely audible at first, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My ears strained to pinpoint it, and my heart began to thud in time with the noise. It came from deeper in the woods, from a direction that seemed to defy logic, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I straightened, slinging the little backpack over my shoulder. "Ethan!" I called again, louder this time. My voice bounced back to me, warped slightly by the trees. Then I heard it, a laugh. A child's laugh. It was faint, almost teasing, but unmistakable. For a split second, hope surged through me. "Ethan?" I called, moving toward the sound. "Is that you? Keep laughing so I can find you." But as I stepped forward, the laughter didn't grow louder. It didn't move closer. If anything, it seemed to drift further away, fading in and out like a phantom. My gut twisted. Something wasn't right. I forced myself to take another step, then another. The forest seemed to shift around me, the air growing colder with each step. The trees loomed closer together, their branches intertwining overhead like a skeletal canopy, blocking out what little light remained. I kept my flashlight trained ahead, the beam trembling slightly with my unsteady hand. The tapping sound started again, louder this time, and it was joined by another noise, a low, almost imperceptible hum. My skin prickled. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but I pushed on. Ethan was out here somewhere, and I couldn't let him stay out in this darkness alone. The forest floor began to slope downward, the terrain becoming uneven and treacherous. I stumbled over a root, catching myself against the rough bark of a tree. My flashlight swung wildly, illuminating patches of forest that looked increasingly alien. The roots of the sequoias twisted and gnarled like grasping fingers. And then, just ahead, something caught my eye. Another clue. A single, small sneaker, half buried in the leaves. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched to pick it up. It was damp, as though it had been sitting there for hours, and the laces were untied, trailing like limp tendrils. "Ethan," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. My voice cracked, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I stuffed the shoe into my pack and stood, my knees shaking slightly. The laugh came again, closer this time. It sent a chill straight down my spine, because it wasn't just a laugh. It was layered, faint echoes that shouldn't have been there, as though the sound was folding in on itself. My grip on the flashlight tightened, and for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of fear. I called his name again, but the words felt hollow now, swallowed by the forest. The towering trees seemed to lean in closer, as if they were listening, watching. As I stood there, clutching that tiny shoe, I felt it, the distinct, undeniable sensation of being observed. Not by an animal, not by something natural. This was different. It was cold, calculating, and impossibly old. The tapping stopped. The laughter ceased. And the silence that followed was louder than anything I had ever heard. The forest was shifting, not in the physical sense, at least not entirely, but in the way it felt, in the way the air grew heavier with each step I took. It was as though the trees themselves were conspiring, their ancient trunks forming a silent council in the dark. My boots crunched over leaves and twigs, each sound unnaturally loud against the eerie silence. Not even the wind dared stir the branches now. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a tree that felt too cold, too smooth, like the skin of something alive. My flashlight beam caught through the darkness, trembling slightly in my hand. That's when I heard it, faint, just on the edge of perception. A child's laughter. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice sounding foreign and hollow in the vast emptiness. The laughter came again, light and carefree, like a boy playing hide and seek. It sent a chill racing down my spine. The sound wasn't where it should have been. It seemed to bounce off the trees, coming first from my left, then behind me, then ahead. I spun around, scanning the forest, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the shadows, but revealing nothing. The laughter faded, leaving a gaping silence that was somehow worse. I forced myself to take a deep breath. "You've been here before," I muttered under my breath. "Stay calm. Follow the clues." But my instincts, the ones that had saved me more times than I cared to count, were screaming at me to turn back. I didn't listen. Instead, I moved forward, following the direction I thought the laughter had come from. The trail was faint, almost imperceptible now, but I caught glimpses of disturbed leaves and small scuffs in the dirt, tiny, frantic movements that could have been Ethan's. I latched onto that shred of evidence like a lifeline. Then I heard it again. The laughter. Louder this time, clearer. It was unmistakably a child's, but there was something wrong. It wasn't just joy. There was an edge to it, something sharp and mocking. I pushed the thought aside and quickened my pace, my flashlight beam darting ahead like a nervous animal. The forest felt alive. The trees seemed to shift in the periphery of my vision, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes, while I wasn't looking directly at them. Once, I was sure I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trunks, but when I swung my flashlight toward it, there was nothing there. "Ethan!" I called again, louder this time. My voice cracked. "If you can hear me, call out." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint voice answered, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. "Over here." Relief and fear collided in my chest. It was Ethan's voice, but it was off. Too faint, too calm for a boy lost in the woods at night. My steps slowed as I tried to pinpoint where it had come from. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "Where are you?" I called, forcing a steadiness into my voice I didn't feel. "Over here," the voice repeated, closer now. My flashlight landed on a cluster of trees up ahead, their trunks so tightly packed they seemed to form a natural barrier. The sound had come from beyond them, I was sure of it. I squeezed between the trees, the bark scraping my jacket. The moment I passed through, the atmosphere shifted. It was colder here, unnaturally so. The air felt thin, almost electric, and the smell of damp air was overpowering. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. The beam of my flashlight flickered and then dimmed slightly. As if the darkest, gear was thicker, more resistant to the light. Then I heard it again. The laughter. not from ahead, but from behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The beam landed on the narrow gap I had just squeezed through. Nothing moved, but the laughter echoed faintly, fading into the distance like a cruel taunt. My heart pounded as I turned back and pressed forward. The logical part of my brain clung to the idea that Ethan was scared, that he was playing tricks in his confusion, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I came to a clearing, man, small and unnatural, the kind of space that feels wrong, as though it shouldn't exist. In the center was a circle of rocks, each one perfectly smooth and positioned with eerie precision. They weren't there by accident. Someone, or something, had placed them. The laughter came again, louder now, and for the first time, it felt like it was all around me. My breath hitched, and my instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. Ethan was out here. He needed me. The flashlight flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, I thought I saw movement, something just at the edge of the clearing, too tall, too thin to be a person. But when the light steadied, there was nothing there. I swallowed hard, forcing my feet to move. Whatever was out here, I told myself, it couldn't be worse than leaving Ethan alone in the dark. At least, that's what I hoped. And yet, as I stepped into the clearing, the laughter stopped completely, and the silence that followed was deafening. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. Not the usual, peaceful hush of nature settling into its nighttime rhythm, but an unnatural, suffocating silence. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Even my boots crunching against the dirt trail seemed muffled, swallowed up by the oppressive atmosphere. My flashlight beam sliced through the encroaching darkness, illuminating gnarled roots and damp foliage, but the shadows felt thicker here, more solid, as if they had weight and intention. I pressed on, gripping the strap of my pack as though it could tether me to reality. Somewhere out here, a little boy needed me. Ethan, 8 years old. Blonde hair, green jacket. His mother's tear-streaked face and the raw panic in his father's voice were fresh in my mind. "He's just a kid," I muttered under my breath, a mantra to keep myself grounded. "He's scared, he's lost, and he needs you." But as I scanned the dark underbrush for any sign of him, my focus wavered. A familiar, unwelcome feeling began to creep in, wrapping around my chest like a cold chain. It was the same sensation I had felt 3 years ago during another search, a mission that hadn't ended in celebration. The name, Emma, clawed its way to the surface of my thoughts, unbidden and sharp. 3 years ago, I'd been in a different part of this forest, searching for a teenage girl who'd wandered off during a camping trip. The terrain had been unforgiving, the weather brutal. I found her too late, her lifeless body half buried in snow at the bottom of a ravine. The image of her pale face, eyes wide and staring, had seared itself into my memory. I had carried the weight of that failure ever since. The forest felt the same tonight, indifferent, unyielding, and ancient in its menace. As if it knew I was vulnerable. As if it remembered. I stopped to catch my breath and knelt to examine a patch of disturbed earth. The faint impression of a small footprint, Ethan's, pointed north, deeper into the woods. Relief warred with apprehension in my chest. I wasn't imagining things. I was on the right track. But the tracks led away from the established trail, into a part of the forest I knew to be treacherous. As I stood, a branch cracked behind me, sharp and deliberate. I spun around, my flashlight darting wildly, but there was nothing, just the endless pillars of the sequoias standing cento. My heart raced as I strained to listen, but the silence pressed in, mocking my efforts. "You're letting your head mess with you," I whispered. "Focus, Kevin." But my mind refused to quiet. It dragged me back to Emma. I had combed these woods for days back then, clinging to hope, pushing myself past exhaustion, only to be met with failure. I could still hear her mother's anguished screams when we brought her body back. The memory was a festering wound, and tonight it bled freely. Another sound, faint and fleeting, a child's laughter. My head snapped toward it, the sound piercing the quiet like a needle through fabric. It wasn't joyful. It was hollow, distant, like it didn't belong in this world. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The laughter came again, closer this time. I sprinted toward it, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. But as I rounded a cluster of thick trunks, the sound abruptly stopped, leaving only the suffocating silence in its wake. I stopped, panting, my breath visible in the suddenly chilled air. My flashlight illuminated a circle of stones on the forest floor, perfectly arranged and unnervingly symmetrical. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crouched to inspect them. They didn't belong here. The forest was wild and chaotic, not orderly. These stones were deliberate, placed with care. But by whom? Or in what? The laughter returned, faint and echoing, as if the forest itself was taunting me. I shuddered and stood, forcing myself to focus. "This isn't about you," I muttered. "It's about Ethan. Keep moving." But the forest wasn't letting me off the hook so easily. Every step forward felt like walking into a trap, and my mind churned with doubts. What if I failed again? What if Ethan's family looked at me tomorrow the same way Emma's parents had, their eyes filled with blame and heartbreak? A breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves overhead. It was the first sound I'd heard from the forest itself in what felt like hours, but instead of comfort, it brought unease. The wind carried with it a faint, almost imperceptible voice, a voice that sounded eerily like Emma's. "Kevin," it seemed to sigh, barely audible. "You can't say them." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible, that it was just the wind in my fraying nerves. But the forest had other ideas. The weight of its ancient, unyielding presence bore down on me, reminding me that I was a mere trespasser here, a speck of insignificance beneath its towering giants. I gripped my flashlight tighter and forced myself to move, following Ethan's faint tracks into the darkness. I couldn't let the forest win, not this time. The forest around me had changed, not just the fading light or the encroaching shadows. Those were expected. This was something deeper, more sinister. The air itself felt heavier, like the forest was breathing in tandem with me, drawing me into its ancient rhythm. My boots crunched softly on the forest floor, the sound strangely muted, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I swung my flashlight in a slow arc, its beam slicing through the darkness. The trees loomed larger here, their massive trunks twisting upward into a canopy, so dense it blocked even the faintest hint of starlight. My breath popped in front of me, visible in the sudden chill that had descended. Something wasn't right. I'd worked this park for over a decade, and the forest had never felt like this before. That's when I saw it, a circle of stones. At first glance, it looked like a child's game. Smooth, flat rocks arranged meticulously in a near-perfect ring on the ground. I crouched down, my gloved fingers brushing the dirt. The stones were too clean, too deliberate, as though they'd been placed there with care. Around the circle, The ground was unnaturally bare. Not a single leaf or twig to clutter the area. I stood and turned in a slow circle, my eyes scanning the shadows for movement. There was nothing, just the trees and the silence. And yet, I felt watched. I adjusted my radio. "Jones here. I'm about 2 miles east of the station. Found a clearing with some strange markers. No sign of the kid yet." Static crackled in response. Then a faint, distorted voice. "Say again, Jones?" I repeated myself, but the static swallowed my words. Frustrated, I clicked the radio back onto my belt and focused on the circle again. I'd seen cairns before, markers left by hikers, but this was different. There was no purpose to it, no trail to mark. It felt wrong, like stumbling into someone else's secret. Then I noticed the trees. The trunks surrounding the clearing were marked with carvings, long, jagged lines that formed crude, angular shapes. My flashlight caught the faint gleam of sap oozing from the cuts, fresh and glistening like open wounds. I moved closer to one, tracing the lines with the beam. The shapes were unfamiliar, not the initials or simple symbols left by campers. They looked almost deliberate, like writing, though not in any language I recognized. A sharp snap echoed behind me. I whirled, flashlight darting through the trees. My hand instinctively went to the knife on my belt. "Ethan?" I called, my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. No response. The forest was still, unnervingly so. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the air thick and unmoving. My skin prickled with the kind of awareness you get when you know you're not alone. I scanned the area again, my flashlight catching glimpses of twisted roots and gnarled branches. Another sound, this time a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. It was distant, but distinct, and it sent a shiver up my spine. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Every direction seemed the same in the suffocating dark. I stepped away from the clearing, my boots crunching on the dirt. The tapping stopped, and then I saw it. On the far side of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, something moved. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, its outline too slender. It slipped behind a tree as soon as my beam found it, but I caught the barest glimpse. Something pale, almost translucent. My pulse quickened. "Ethan," I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed off the trees, swallowed quickly by the dense forest. The silence that followed was louder than any reply. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. Logic told me it was an animal, maybe a deer or even a large bird, but something deeper, primal, screamed that it was neither. I'd seen plenty of animals in this park. This felt different. Ran. Forcing myself to move, I stepped back toward the clearing and scanned the carvings again, hoping for a distraction from the growing sense of dread. That's when I noticed something else. A smell. It was faint at first, like burnt wood, but as I inhaled again, it grew stronger, sharper. It was acrid, unnatural, and it clung to the back of my throat like smoke. The tapping started again, closer this time. I turned slowly, flashlight raised, and froze. In the distance, between two massive trunks, a pair of glinting points reflected back at me. Eyes. They were too high to belong to a child, too still to belong to an animal. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. "Jones here," I said, fumbling for my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "If anyone's on this channel, respond now." "I'm Guy." The stag thrown me out again, louder this time. as if the radio itself was rejecting my words. I let go of the button and gripped my flashlight tighter. The eyes vanished, leaving me staring at empty darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually my training kicked in. I forced myself to breathe, to think. If I wanted to find Ethan, I couldn't let the forest get in my head. I had to move. But as I left the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was following me, its unseen presence pressing closer with every step. The forest opened suddenly, like the exhale of a trapped breath. One moment, I was pushing through dense underbrush, my flashlight carving weak beams through the gloom, and the next, I stumbled into a vast clearing bathed in an eerie, pale light. The towering sequoias encircled it, their silhouettes forming an impenetrable wall, as if they were guardians of something ancient and sacred, or profane. And there he was. Ethan sat at the base of a massive, gnarled tree at the clearing's center. His small frame looked impossibly fragile against the enormous trunk, the roots twisting around him like a giant's hand. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. He just sat there, staring up into the canopy, utterly still. My heart surged with relief and dread in equal measure. "Ethan!" I called, my voice cracking. I started forward, my boots crunching on the thick layer of pine needles carpeting the ground. He didn't react. "Ethan, it's okay. I'm here to take you back to your parents." Still nothing. As I approached, the air around me seemed to grow heavier, pressing against my chest like a weight. I swallowed hard and crouched in front of him. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted, and his wide eyes fixed on something above us. I followed his gaze. I saw nothing at first. Just the canopy of the tree, its branches twisted into unnatural shapes, intertwining like skeletal fingers. But then something shifted, slowly, deliberately. My breath caught. Shadows. Not the kind cast by leaves or moonlight, but deeper, darker, and wrong. They moved against the grain of the light, bending and twisting like smoke in water. Shades began to form, elongated limbs, followed eyes that seemed to drink in the light. They weren't fully there, but they weren't absent either. I reached for Ethan, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. His skin was cold, almost clammy, and at my touch, he finally blinked. Slowly, his gaze lowered to meet mine. His lips trembled, and then he whispered, so softly I had to lean closer to hear him. "They don't want me to leave." The words sent a shiver down my spine, not just because of what he said, but because of how he said it, calmly, as though it were a simple fact, like telling me the sky was blue. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my gut, "I'm going to get you out of here. Can you stand?" His gaze flicked upward again, and he shook his head, almost imperceptibly. "Why not?" I pressed, glancing over my shoulder. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. The shadows were moving again, faster now, circling the clearing like vultures. "They said I can," he replied, his voice barely audible. My grip on his shoulder tightened. "Listen to me, Ethan. They don't decide what you can or can't do. You're coming with me." The air grew colder. I could feel it now, a creeping chill seeping into my bones. The shadows above us began to take form, elongated figures that stretched impossibly tall, their shapes flickering in and out of focus. And then they moved, not with the slow, deliberate motion I had seen before, but with sudden, jerking swiftness. One of them darted down, its shadowy limb brushing the tree trunk just inches from Ethan. I grabbed him, pulling him into my arms, as he finally let out a sharp cry. That was all I needed. I stood, holding him tightly, and took a step back, then another, my every instinct screaming at me to run. But the forest wasn't done with us. The shadows descended, their movements chaotic, their forms almost indistinguishable from the darkness itself. My flashlight flickered violently, casting erratic beams that only made the shapes more terrifying. The clearing felt alive, the ground beneath me vibrating faintly, as though the earth itself was protesting our presence. I turned and ran. With Ethan in my arms, I barreled back toward the forest's edge, ignoring the low whispers that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The trees ahead looked different, closer together, darker, as if the forest were reshaping itself to trap us. Ethan buried his face in my chest, and I could feel him trembling. "Don't look back," I muttered, more to myself than to him. My breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, the weight of the boy and the oppressive cold sapping my strength. Behind us, the shadows pursued. I could hear them, an unsettling, almost insect-like chittering that grew louder with every step. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I pushed through the suffocating darkness, driven by something primal, something that told me stopping wasn't an option. Whatever those things were, they didn't belong in the light. And neither did we. The clearing was vast, an open wound in the forest where no sunlight seemed to reach, despite the break in the canopy above. The towering sequoias ringed the space like silent sentinels, their gnarled roots clawing at the earth. In the center, Ethan sat cross-legged at the base of a colossal tree, his small frame dwarfed by the ancient giant. His back was to me, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching softly against the brittle leaves underfoot. "Ethan," I called, keeping my voice calm, though my heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in the unnatural silence. He didn't react. As I drew closer, the air grew colder, biting through my jacket. There was no wind, yet the leaves on the ground seemed to tremble, as if something unseen had brushed past them. My every instinct screamed that something was wrong, terribly, irrevocably wrong. But I couldn't leave him there. "Ethan," I tried again, louder this time, my voice breaking slightly. I was within a few feet of him now. Slowly, he turned his head to the side, just enough for me to see his profile. His face was pale, his expression blank, but his lips parted as he spoke, his voice soft and chilling. "They don't want me to leave." I froze. What do you mean, buddy?" I managed to stammer, crouching down to his level. "Who doesn't want you to leave?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes flicked upward, toward the towering tree behind him. Following his gaze, I tilted my head back, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The shadows in the canopy weren't just shadows. At first, it was hard to make sense of them. They shifted and flowed like ink in water, merging and separating with a strange, fluid motion. Then they began to take shape, elongated limbs, impossibly thin and angular, unfurling from the darkness. What looked like eyes appeared, hollow and glowing faintly, staring down on us with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. My entire body tensed, a primal fear clawing at my chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't even something I could rationalize. It simply was. I reached for Ethan, grabbing his arm gently but firmly. "We need to go," I whispered, though my voice felt foreign, trembling with fear. "They're watching," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible. "They don't want me to leave." The presence above seemed to respond, the shadows shifting violently. The air itself felt heavier, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. I felt a low vibration beneath my feet, as if the forest was alive and angry. My flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering in the dark like a dying ember. The tree's bark seemed to pulse, faint grooves forming patterns that looked like faces. Faces contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. I didn't wait to understand it. Gripping Ethan tightly, I hauled him to his feet. He moved reluctantly, his legs stiff as if he were resisting some unseen force. "We are leaving," I said, my voice firmer now, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. Right now. As I turned, the shadows above moved again, faster this time, as though the thing, or things, were descending. The sound of snapping branches echoed through the clearing, followed by a deep, guttural noise that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I tightened my grip on Ethan and started to run. The forest around us blurred as my focus narrowed to the path ahead, or what I hoped was a path. The ground seemed to shift beneath us, the roots of the trees rising like twisted fingers trying to trip me. I could feel the presence behind us, its oppressive energy closing in, pushing me to move faster even as fear threatened to paralyze me. Ethan stumbled, and I nearly lost my hold on him. "Come on, buddy, keep going," I urged, pulling him along. My voice was firm, but inside I was panicking, desperate to put as much distance between us and that clearing as possible. The presence didn't relent. The guttural noise grew louder, closer, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward us, like black tendrils reaching out to drag us back. My flashlight was useless now, flickering in my hand, as if the very darkness was consuming it. I didn't know how far we'd run before the noise began to fade, but it felt like an eternity. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, though the sense of being watched never left. I finally allowed myself to glance over my shoulder, and for a moment, I thought I saw glowing eyes in the distance, watching from the shadows. Then they blinked out, swallowed by the darkness. Breathing hard, I stopped to kneel beside Ethan, who was trembling but unharmed. He clung to me, his small hands gripping my jacket tightly. "Is it gone?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I didn't know. Instead, I stood and picked him up, cradling him against my chest as I forced my legs to keep moving. I didn't look back again. I didn't dare. The forest was silent once more, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, letting us go, for now. I grabbed Ethan, his small hand cold and limp in mine. He didn't resist, but his feet dragged as if he were wading through deep water. "Ethan, we have to go," I said, my voice firm but edged with a desperation I couldn't mask. His wide eyes stared up at me, unblinking, reflecting the faint glimmer of my failing flashlight. The forest around us seemed alive, shifting in a way that defied logic. The trees, ancient and unyielding, loomed closer, their massive trunks leaning inward as though conspiring to trap us. I knew this section of the park like the back of my hand, or so I thought, but now every path felt unfamiliar. The air itself had thickened, each breath an effort. "Come on, Ethan," I urged again, pulling him forward. He stumbled, his small legs moving mechanically, but he followed. Behind us, the shadows deepened, swelling like ink spilled across the forest floor. I didn't dare look back. Then it came, the sound. A low, guttural hum that vibrated in my chest, more felt than heard. It was everywhere and nowhere, a warning and a threat all at once. I tightened my grip on Ethan's hand, afraid that if I let go, he disappeared into the darkness. The hum grew louder, shifting into a distorted cacophony of whispers. My name was among them, spoken in tones both mocking and pleading. Kevin. Kevin. It wasn't just my name. It was my thoughts, my fears, my failures, spoken aloud and twisted into something grotesque. My legs felt heavy, each step a monumental effort. The forest wasn't just trying to stop us, it was wearing us down. My flashlight flickered again, its weak beam bouncing off the towering sequoias. Shadows darted in the corners of my vision, moving too quickly to track. I glanced at Ethan. His gaze was locked on something behind us. "Don't look," I said sharply, though my own resolve was failing. "Just keep moving." The path ahead narrowed, forcing us to squeeze through a gap between two massive trees. Their bark was rough and cold against my arm, but as I passed, I felt something else. A tremor, as if the trees themselves were shivering. I pushed Ethan through, urging him to keep going, but when I turned to follow, my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood there, just beyond the tree line. Or at least, I thought it was a figure. It had no discernible shape, just a mass of writhing shadows, its form shifting and dissolving like smoke caught in an invisible wind. Its eyes, or the spaces where eyes should have been, glowed faintly, hollow and unrelenting. It didn't move toward us, but it didn't need to. Its presence alone was suffocating. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen, my grip on Ethan slackening. For a moment, I felt like I was back in a failed rescue, watching helplessly as another life slipped away. "No!" The word escaped my lips in a growl, more to myself than anyone else. I forced my legs to move, pulling Ethan along as I stumbled forward. The whispers followed us, louder now, mingling with the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling in the absence of wind. The path ahead forked, except it wasn't supposed to. I knew this area. There was no fork here. My heart sank. The forest was playing tricks, warping itself to trap us. I hesitated, trying to decide which way to go, when Ethan suddenly tugged on my hand. "This way," he whispered, his voice flat and eerily calm. He pointed to the left, toward a trail so narrow it was barely visible. For a brief, maddening moment, I considered trusting him. But then I remembered the way he had stared at that presence, how it seemed to have a hold on him. "No," I said, pulling him toward the wider path to the right. "Not that way." The forest resisted. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tilt, and I stumbled, nearly losing my footing. Ethan let out a sharp gasp as he fell against me. Behind us, the hum grew louder, rising to a deafening roar. The shadows were closing in, and I could feel their cold tendrils brushing against the back of my neck. I broke into a run, half carrying, half dragging Ethan. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The path twisted and turned, each step taking us deeper into the maze of the forest. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down. Focus. Move. Survive. Then, a faint light appeared ahead. It was weak, barely more than a glimmer, but it was enough. "Walk, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling. "We're almost there." The boy didn't respond, but he followed. The light grew brighter, cutting through the oppressive darkness. The whispers faltered, replaced by an angry, guttural hiss. I could feel the presence receding, its grip loosening as we neared the edge of the forest. We burst through the tree just as dawn broke over the horizon. The first rays of sunlight spilled across the landscape, golden and warm. Behind us, the forest stood silent, its towering sequoias bathed in light. The oppressive weight lifted from my chest, replaced by a wave of exhaustion so overwhelming I nearly collapsed. Ethan clung to me, trembling now, his earlier calm replaced by quiet sobs. I held him close, my own breath ragged, my mind racing. We had escaped, but the forest had let us go. I was certain of it. Whatever had been in there, it wasn't finished with us. As I looked back at the shadows still lingering among the trees, I knew this wouldn't be a story I could forget. The forest had secrets, and we had only scratched the surface. The forest was alive, and it hated me. Every direction looked the same, trees standing like sentinels, their shadows long and menacing in the weak moonlight. My breath came fast and shallow as I carried Ethan, his small body limp in my arms. He hadn't said a word since I'd found him, his glassy eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, something that seemed to be pulling him away from me. The air had changed. It was heavier, colder, pressing against my chest like a living thing. Even the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. Only the crunch of my boots on the uneven ground and the pounding of my heart broke the silence. "We're almost there," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. I had no idea where there was any more. The trail I'd memorized over a decade of patrolling these woods was gone, swallowed by an endless maze of trees. Every step felt like a mistake, like I was sinking deeper into a trap. Then it happened again. The forest shifted. It was subtly forced. The trees seemed to sway, their massive trunks bending impossibly toward me. The air grew colder still, and a low hum started in the back of my skull, vibrating like a distant engine. My footing faltered as the ground beneath me seemed to tilt, pulling me toward the deeper woods. I stopped and set Ethan down for a moment, my arms screaming from the strain. He didn't react, just sat there, staring ahead with that unnerving calm. His silence was worse than any scream. "Ethan," I said, crouching in front of him, gripping his shoulders. "We need to move. Do you understand? We have to get out of here." My voice cracked, and I hated the desperation in it. He blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream, and for a fleeting moment, his gaze met mine. His lips parted, and he whispered, "They're not done yet." A shiver ran down my spine, and before I could ask what he meant, the forest erupted. The trees around us groaned, their massive limbs twisting like writhing serpents. Shadows danced along the ground, converging, moving with purpose. The hum in my skull grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of whispers. Words I couldn't understand clawed in my mind, each syllable sharper than the last. I grabbed Ethan and bolted. The ground wasn't steady anymore. It felt like running across a rolling deck, each step threatening to throw me off balance. Roots reached up like skeletal fingers, clawing at my boots, slowing me down. My flashlight flickered wildly, its weak beam slicing through the chaos, but offering little comfort. The whispers followed me, growing louder, closer. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were all around us, coming from the trees, the shadows, even the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, hunger, hatred. I tripped over a root and went down hard, twisting to shield Ethan as we hit the ground. Pain exploded in my side, and for a moment, the world spun. I gasped for air, my ribs burning, but there was no time to stop. "Get out," I muttered to myself, dragging us both upright. "Get up, Kevin. Move." I forced my legs to keep going, pushing through the pain, the terror. The forest fought me at every step, the roots thicker, the branches clawing at my face and arms. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and I realized they weren't random. They were saying my name. Kevin, biggest, over and over, in voices that weren't human. Panic clawed at my throat, but I couldn't let it take over. I focused on Ethan, on his tiny, fragile body in my arms, and forced myself to keep running. Ahead, I saw a break in the trees, a faint, pale light filtering through. It wasn't dawn, not yet, but it was something. I didn't care what it was. I ran for it. The light grew brighter as I approached, and the whispers turned to shrieks. The air around us seemed to ripple, the shadows recoiling from the light as if burned. The ground steadied beneath my feet, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. As we burst through the break in the trees, I felt the presence behind me, pressing against my back like a tide trying to drag me under. I didn't dare look back. We collapsed into the clearing, and the silence was immediate. The whispers, the shrieks, the groaning trees, all of it was gone, snuffed out like a flame. The light enveloped us, warm and calming, though I couldn't see its source. Ethan stirred in my arms, his eyes blinking rapidly as if waking from a nightmare. "It's gone," he murmured, his voice hoarse but certain. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just held him tighter, my own breath ragged, my heart thundering in my chest. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe we might survive this. But even as the light comforted me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting. The forest wasn't done with us. Not yet. The forest was alive, breathing around me in ways I couldn't explain, and I was running out of time. Ethan clung to my side, his small hand gripping mine, with a strength that didn't match his pale, trembling frame. His silence unnerved me. I couldn't tell if it was shock, fear, or something else entirely. A shadow of the presence that seemed to follow us with every step. The air was heavier now, tinged with a strange metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. My flashlight flickered again, throwing erratic beams of light that danced across the ancient bark of the sequoias. Each flicker seemed to summon movement just beyond its reach. Shadows shifting, branches swaying, things I couldn't, or wouldn't, let myself fully see. I focused on the ground instead, on the trail I had memorized over years of patrolling this park. The trail that now seemed foreign, wrong, like the forest had twisted itself into something else entirely. I squeezed Ethan's hand. "Almost there, buddy. Just stay with me," I whispered, more for myself than for him. My voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the trees. Behind us, the sound came again, a low, guttural hum, resonating like a distant growl but layered with something almost human. It wasn't chasing us outright. It didn't need to. It was hurting us, playing with us, testing how far we could go before we broke. And I was close. God, I was close. The trail forked ahead, two paths stretching into the shadowy unknown. I stopped, panting, trying to orient myself. My chest heaved as I looked left, then right, but neither path felt right. The presence pressed closer, the hum growing louder, vibrating in my ribs like the growl of a predator closing in. Ethan tugged on my hand, his voice a whisper so soft I barely heard it. "This way." His wide eyes locked on the path to the left. His expression, calm, detached, sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the face of an 8-year-old boy lost in the woods. It was something older, something knowing. But I didn't have a choice. If I hesitated too long, we'd never make it out. I followed him. The left path was narrower, more overgrown, and it didn't make sense. I'd walked these trails hundreds of times. This was one of them. Yet Ethan moved as if he'd always known he was there, his steps deliberate, even though I still had to guide him. My heart pounded harder. Each step felt like a gamble, like the ground might give way to some dark abyss if I made the wrong move. The hum shifted, no longer distant but all around us, vibrating in the leaves, the trees, even the ground beneath my boots. The forest grew colder, and my breath came in white puffs that vanished almost instantly. My flashlight sputtered and went out entirely, plunging us into near-total darkness. That was when I saw it. Ahead, through the trees, there was light. Faint, golden light filtering through the black canopy, hazy but real. The edges of the world seemed to soften around it, as if it didn't belong here, as if it was something the forest couldn't touch. Hope surged through my chest, cutting through the fear, and I picked up the pace, practically dragging Ethan with me. The light grew brighter as we neared, and with it came a strange sensation, like stepping out of deep water and into open air. The oppressive hum faded, replaced by the sound of leaves rustling in a breeze. I hadn't realized how quiet the forest had been until I heard it again. My lungs burned, but I pushed on, stumbling toward the light with every ounce of strength I had left. We broke through the trailing just as the first rays of dawn spilled over the horizon. The golden light washed over us, warm and safe, dispelling the cold grip that had clung to me all night. I collapsed to my knees, pulling Ethan into my arms. For the first time since I found him, he clung back, shaking, his small body racked with silent sobs. But as I held him, my eyes darted back to the forest. It loomed behind us, dark and ancient, its massive trees standing like silent sentinels. The line between safety and the unknown was stark, too stark. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had let us go, not because we'd won, but because it wanted us to leave. For now. Ethan's voice broke the silence, muffled against my jacket. They didn't want you to leave. My heart stopped. I pulled back to look at him, but his face was buried in my chest. What did you say? I asked, my voice hoarse, almost afraid of the answer. He didn't respond. He just clung tighter, and for a long moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The golden light of dawn felt too thin, too fragile, as if the forest might reclaim us at any moment. But it didn't. For now we were safe. But as I stood and carried Ethan back toward the ranger station, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever lived in that forest wasn't done with me yet. And it never would be. Ethan's small body slumped against me, his head resting limply on my shoulder as I trudged through the thinning forest. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the unseen force I had battled all night still clung to me, its invisible tendrils trying to pull me back. The first pale rays of dawn filtered through the canopy, and the oppressive darkness finally began to loosen its grip. But the unease hadn't lifted. It only simmered beneath the surface. I could hear the distant hum of voices long before I saw the ranger station. The sound cut through the stillness of the forest like a beacon, sharp and jarring after hours of eerie silence. As I emerged from the trees, the sight of Ethan's family waiting just beyond the parking lot sent a wave of relief crashing over me. But it was fleeting. The boy in my arms was no longer crying. He wasn't clinging to me in desperation or babbling incoherently like other children I'd rescued before. He was eerily calm. Too calm. His wide, unblinking eyes stared straight ahead, the faintest tremble in his lips the only sign that he was even aware of the world around him. Ethan! His mother's voice pierced the early morning air as she sprinted toward us, her face a mask of raw desperation and hope. Behind her, Ethan's father followed, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to reach us. I barely had time to kneel before they were on us, pulling Ethan from my arms and wrapping him in theirs. "Oh, my baby," his mother sobbed, clutching him so tightly I half expected him to cry out in protest. But Ethan didn't. He just stood there, limp and silent, his gaze fixed on the line of trees behind me. His father turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed but burning with gratitude. "Thank you," he choked out. "You don't know what this means." "You don't?" I nodded, unable to find words. My throat was dry, my mind racing with questions I couldn't voice. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd felt? The shifting shadows, the way the forest itself seemed to breathe and watch, the unnatural cold that had seeped into my very bones? None of it made sense, not in a way that anyone would believe. "Did he say anything?" the mother asked suddenly, pulling back just enough to search her son's face. Her hands cupped his cheeks, but Ethan didn't respond. "Ethan, sweetie, what happened? Where did you go? What did you see?" Her voice cracked, and my stomach twisted as Ethan's lips parted, just slightly. For a moment, I thought he was finally going to speak. Instead, he tilted his head ever so slightly toward the forest. His small hand, pale and trembling, lifted to point toward the towering sequoias. "They didn't want me to leave," he whispered, his voice so soft he was almost swallowed by the wind. A chill skittered down my spine. "What?" "Who?" his father asked, his grip tightening protectively on Ethan's shoulder. "Who didn't want you to leave?" Ethan didn't answer. He just blinked slowly and buried his face in his mother's chest, his small hands clutching at her jacket. His parents exchanged a worried glance before turning back to me. "He's probably just in shock," I say quickly, though I didn't believe it myself. I was grasping for something, anything, to fill the silence. "It was a long night. He needs rest. Give him time." They nodded hesitantly, clearly unsure but too overwhelmed to argue. As they carried Ethan toward the waiting ambulance, I stayed rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the forest's edge. For a long time, I stood there, the weight of the forest pressing against my back. The station felt too small, too fragile. I knew I should go inside, write up my report, and put this behind me. But my feet wouldn't move. The forest stretched before me, ancient and endless. It had let me go, but only just. I felt that truth in my bones. Whatever lived in those woods, it wasn't finished. Not with me, not with Ethan, not with anyone who dared to walk beneath those towering giants. I turned and walked back into the station, forcing myself to focus on the mundane tasks of the day. But as I sat down to write my report, the pen hovered over the page, the words tangled and heavy in my mind. How could I explain something I didn't understand? How could I admit that the forest, for all its beauty and grandeur, wasn't just alive, it was aware? In the end, I wrote what they expected. A standard report, boy found safe and sound. No injuries. No unusual incidents. But as I handed it in, my fingers lingered on the paper, and a thought whispered through my mind, next time, we might not be so lucky. That night, I drove home in silence. The sequoias lined the road like watchful giants, their shadows long and deep in the moonlight. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I felt their gaze on me all the same, as if the forest itself was warning me. Its secrets were not mine to tell. The wind had started howling through the Black Canyon earlier than usual that evening, a mournful sound that bounced off the towering cliffs and echoed through the emptiness. I was perched on a stool in the ranger station, sipping lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos and flipping through a field guide I'd read a dozen times. Winter was creeping in fast, turning the trails into icy labyrinths and driving visitors away. Most days, the solitude was comforting, even meditative. Tonight, it felt oppressive. That's when the radio crackled to life. "Thomas, you there?" "Over." I leaned forward, the chair creaking beneath me. It was Maria, her voice sharp and urgent. Maria rarely called for small talk. "I'm here," I said, pressing the button on the radio. "What's up?" "Over." "We've got a situation," she said, her words clipped. "Group of 3 hikers. Late 20s. No check-in for 2 days. Family just reported them missing. Last seen heading toward Devil's Backbone." "Over." I felt a chill creep up my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. Devil's Backbone was one of the park's most dangerous trails, a jagged, narrow path with sheer drops on either side. Even in good weather, it wasn't for the faint of heart. In winter, it was a death trap. 48 hours? I repeated, my voice tightening. What the hell were they thinking heading up there this time of year? Over. Doesn't matter what they were thinking. We've got to find them before the storm gets worse, Maria snapped. Can you gear up and meet me at the trailhead? Over. I stood, the stool scraping loudly against the wooden floor. I'll be there in 15. Over. The radio went silent, and I set it down with more force than I intended. My hand lingered on it for a moment as I stared out the station's frost-rimmed window. The sky outside was a bruised shade of gray, and snowflakes were already starting to drift down like ashes from some distant fire. I moved quickly, grabbing my gear, a heavy-duty flashlight, extra batteries, thermal blankets, climbing rope, and a first aid kit. My pack was already prepped for emergencies like this, though, truth be told, I hadn't had to use it for anything serious in years. Most of the time, it was lost tourists or minor injuries. But Devil's Backbone? That was a different beast altogether. As I zipped up my parka and strapped on my boots, a gnawing thought clawed its way into my mind. Why hadn't the hikers turned back when the weather started to shift? 48 hours in these conditions wasn't just reckless, it was suicidal. The drive to the trailhead was short but harrowing. The narrow park roads were coated in a thin layer of ice, and the snow was coming down harder now, reducing visibility to little more than a few feet ahead. The headlights of my truck carved weak tunnels through the darkness, the trees on either side looming like silent sentinels. When I arrived, Maria was already there. Leaning against her truck with her arms crossed and her breath fogging in the freezing air. She was bundled up in her ranger gear, her face partially obscured by a thick scarf. Even so, I could see the worry etched into her features. "Took you long enough," she said, her tone more teasing than accusatory. That was Maria, always trying to keep things light, even when the situation was anything but. "Had to make sure I packed my sense of humor," I replied, slinging my pack over one shoulder. "Something tells me I'm going to need it." She didn't laugh. Instead, she handed me a laminated map, her glove finger tapping a red circle she'd drawn near the midpoint of Devil's Backbone. "This is their last confirmed location," she said. "They checked in with a friend by text around noon 2 days ago. Said they were taking a break here before heading further in. After that, nothing." I frowned, studying the map. The red circle was perched dangerously close to a stretch of trail known for its unpredictable rock slides, and sudden drop-offs. Do we know anything about them? I asked. Experience level, gear, anything useful? Maria shook her head. Not much. Their families said they'd done a few day hikes, but nothing like this. No permits for overnight camping, so they weren't planning to stay out there. We're guessing they underestimated the trail and the weather. I let out a slow breath, my chest tight. It was a story I'd heard too many times before. People saw the beauty of the canyon and forgot about its teeth. Let's move, I said, tossing the straps on my pack. If they're still alive, they won't be for much longer in this cold. Maria nodded, and together we started up the trail. The snow crunched beneath our boots, the sound sharp and jarring in the otherwise suffocating silence. The trees seemed to close in around us as we ascended, their branches heavy with snow, their shadows long and menacing in the dim beam of our flashlights. As we climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The canyon had a way of playing tricks on your mind, making every gust of wind sound like a whisper, every shifting shadow feel like a watchful eye. But this wasn't my first search and rescue mission, and I knew better than to let my imagination get the best of me. Still, there was something about tonight, something in the air, that felt different. The kind of different that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. And as we pushed further into the darkness, the sense of unease only grew stronger. The morning air bit into my skin as I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The black canyon stretched out before me, its jagged cliffs like the teeth of some ancient beast. The sun was rising, but its light barely kissed the shadows at the bottom of the gorge. Even in the daylight, this place was unnervingly dark, like it held secrets too old and too terrible for human eyes. Maria writhed, her breath visible in the cold air, already muttering about the weather. Storms coming faster than they said, she noted, her voice low but firm. She was right. The sky to the west was a bright shade of gray, and I could smell the snow on the wind. Then we better move, I replied, checking my pack one last time. Flashlight, rope, thermal blanket, first aid, everything was accounted for. My rifle, slung across my shoulder, felt heavier than usual, as though it knew what lay ahead. The missing hikers were a young group, mid-20s, according to the report. 2 men and 1 woman. Experienced but not overly so, the type that underestimated the canyon's unforgiving nature. Their last known location was near the painted wall overlook, but that was over 48 hours ago. Out here in this cold, that could be a lifetime. Maria and I started down the trail, our boots crunching on frost-covered ground. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional call of a raven overhead. I'd always loved the stillness of the park, but today it felt different, too quiet, like the canyon itself was holding its breath. We reached the first mile marker without incident. The overlook loomed ahead, the view breathtaking as always. The river below looked like a silver thread, twisting and turning between the black stone walls. But there was no sign of the hikers. No discarded gear, no footprints, nothing. They should have been here, Maria said, scanning the area with her binoculars. This is where the report said they were last seen. Maybe they moved deeper in, I said, though my gut told me otherwise. People didn't just vanish, not without leaving something behind. We pressed on, following the trail that snaked along the edge of the canyon. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, as though the canyon was watching us, waiting to see what we'd do. About an hour later, we found the first clue. A backpack, half buried under a pile of leaves, just off the trail. I crouched down to examine it, brushing away the debris. The straps were frayed, as though it had been dragged across the ground. Name tags torn off, Maria said, kneeling beside me. But it's not been here long. The snow hasn't covered it. I nodded, my stomach tightening. I opened the bag, finding a water bottle, a map, and a half-eaten protein bar. No wallet, no phone. It felt deliberate, like someone or something had emptied it before leaving it here. Think they dropped it running? Maria asked, her voice softer now. Or it was left here for us to find, I said, my own voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy, like they carried more truth than I wanted to admit. We kept moving, the trail narrowing as it hugged the canyon wall. The wind howled through the crevices, making it hard to hear anything else. Maria stopped suddenly, her hand chewing out to grab my arm. Look, she said, pointing ahead. At first, I didn't see it. Then it caught my eye. A branch, snapped clean in two, hanging from a tree at an odd angle. It wasn't unusual to find broken branches after a storm, but this one was different. The break was too clean, too precise, as though it had been done intentionally. Trail marker? Maria asked. Not one of ours, I said, stepping closer. The ground beneath, it was disturbed, the soil loose and scattered. Boot prints. But they didn't make sense. They started and stopped abruptly, as though whoever made them had vanished into thin air. A shiver ran down my spine, though the air hadn't grown any colder. I exchanged a glance with Maria, her usual stoic expression replaced by something I hadn't seen before, unease. Let's keep moving, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. We had a job to do, and standing around wouldn't help those hikers. As we continued, the trail seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, despite the sun still hanging in the sky. The further we went, the more it felt like the canyon was closing in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees, a flicker of something that wasn't there when I turned my head. Each time, I told myself it was nothing, but I wasn't sure I believed it. We didn't speak much after that. Words felt too loud, too intrusive, like they didn't belong here. The canyon demanded silence, and we obeyed. But in that silence, my thoughts raced. What had happened to those hikers? And what were we walking into? As we rounded a bend, the wind carried with it a sound that froze me in my tracks, a faint, high-pitched whistle. It wasn't the wind. It was human. I turned to Maria, but she had heard it too, her eyes wide and searching the trail ahead. Let's move, I said, gripping the strap of my pack tighter. And for the first time since the search began, I felt like the prey. The first light of dawn cast a pale, silvery glow across the canyon as Maria and I set out along the North Vista Trail. The world around us was eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of our boots against the frost-covered earth. I had walked this trail 100 times before, but today it felt unfamiliar, almost hostile, as if the canyon itself were holding its breath. Maria walked ahead, her radio crackling faintly with static from the storm brewing in the distance. She was a solid ranger, calm under pressure and quick on her feet, but even she looked uneasy. I couldn't blame her. Something about this call didn't sit right with me either. 48 hours was a long time for hikers to go unaccounted for, especially out here. The canyon wasn't forgiving, and it had a way of swallowing people whole. We reached a fork in the trail where the map indicated the hikers had planned to take a route toward exclamation point, a popular overlook. Maria pointed to the right. "They should have gone this way," she said, her voice steady. I nodded, scanning the area. The snow was thin here, patchy and uneven, but enough to hold tracks. I crouched down to examine a faint set of boot prints. "Here," I said, gesturing. 3 pairs headed north. "Looks like they stayed together." Maria leaned over my shoulder. "Could be them." "So far, so good." We followed the tracks, and at first, they seemed to lead us in the right direction. But after half a mile, they veered sharply off the main trail, cutting through the underbrush toward a steeper, more dangerous slope. "Why would they leave the path?" Maria muttered, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "I don't know." My voice sounded distant even to my own ears. Something was wrong, very wrong. As we descended the slope, the tracks grew erratic. The snow was disturbed, as though they had been running or staggering. Then, abruptly, the print stopped. I stared at the blank stretch of snow, my pulse quickening. "That's not possible." Maria crouched beside me, frowning. "It's like they just disappeared." I scanned the area, my eyes darting to the surrounding trees, and the sheer rock faces looming above us. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken branches, no scuff marks, nothing. Just a clean, unbroken field of snow. Maria stood and dusted off her gloves. "Maybe they backtracked and the wind covered the prints?" I shook my head. "The wind hasn't picked up yet. Look at the snow. It's undisturbed except for their trail." "Animals?" she offered, though her tone was uncertain. I considered the possibility, but dismissed it just as quickly. If it were animals, we'd see signs, blood, drag marks. This is something else. We pressed on, following the slope until we came to a narrow ravine. That's where we found the backpack. It was lying in an awkward angle, half buried in the snow, the zipper partially open. I knelt to examine it. The fabric was torn, as if it had been snagged or deliberately slashed. Inside, I found a water bottle, a map, and a single glove. No food, no extra clothing, nothing that might have helped them survive the night. "Looks like someone dropped it in a hurry," Maria said, her voice tight. "Or abandoned it," I replied. "But why?" Maria stood a few feet away, scanning the horizon with her binoculars. "I'm not seeing anything. No smoke, no movement." She lowered the binoculars and looked at me. "What are you thinking?" I hesitated, running my gloved fingers over the torn fabric. "I don't know yet. But this," I held up the backpack, "this feels deliberate." Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to. I could see the unease in her eyes, the same feeling gnawing at my gut. Something wasn't adding up, and the canyon silence was starting to feel oppressive, like it was closing it around us. As we climbed back to the main trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was hard to shake, even though I knew logically we were alone. At least, I hoped we were. By the time we reached a clearing, the sky had darkened, the storm clouds rolling in faster than we'd expected. I turned to Maria, my voice firm. "We need to move quickly. Whatever happened here, these people are in trouble, and we don't have much daylight left." She nodded, adjusting her pack. "Agreed. Let's keep going." But as we pressed forward, a single thought lingered in the back of my mind, growing louder with each step. If the hikers didn't disappear on their own, what or who was responsible? The snow crunched beneath our boots as Maria and I moved deeper into the canyon. The air was so still it felt like we were intruding on a sacred space, breaking a silence that had existed for centuries. The cliff walls loomed high above us, their jagged faces glinting faintly in the overcast light. Snowflakes began to fall, each one delicate, yet a warning of what was to come. The storm was closing in, and so was the clock. It was Maria who spotted the campsite first, a faint smudge of color through the trees. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the wilderness playing games with our tired eyes. But as we got closer, my stomach sank. It was real, and it was wrong. The tent looked like it had been hastily abandoned. The fabric flapped weakly in the light wind, one side slashed open in jagged lines. The opening yawned like a gaping wound, the edges stained with something dark. Blood. Not much, but enough to set my nerves alight. "Jesus," Maria whispered, crouching down near the entrance. She ran a gloved hand over the torn fabric, her brow furrowed. "Animal attack?" I shook my head. "Doesn't look like it. Animals usually rip from the outside in, trying to get at food or people. This was cut from the inside." She looked up at me, her expression shifting from concern to something closer to fear. We both knew what that meant. Whoever had been inside the tent had slashed their way out, desperate to escape something or someone. I stepped around her and peered inside the tent. The interior was a mess. A sleeping bag lay crumpled against one wall, partially unzipped, as if its occupant had bolted in the middle of the night. There were a few scattered belongings, a flashlight with dead batteries, a half-eaten protein bar, and a water bottle knocked on its side, its contents frozen solid. Everything felt untouched, frozen in the moment whoever had been here decided to run for their life. Then I saw the blood. It wasn't much, just a few drops spattered on the fabric near the torn opening, but it was enough to tell a story. Someone had been hurt, maybe not fatally, but enough to leave a mark. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Blood meant urgency, and urgency meant we were running out of time. Maria leaned over my shoulder. "There's no sign of tracks leading away. Snow's covered everything." I nodded, my throat dry. That was the problem with snow. It erased the past, covering up whatever story the ground might have told. But something about the scene didn't sit right with me. The chaos inside the tent, the clean cuts in the fabric, it felt orchestrated, deliberate. "Let's check the perimeter," I said, stepping back out into the open air. "Maybe they left something behind." We spread out, combing the area for clues. I tried to focus, but the quiet was oppressive, like the canyon itself was holding its breath. Every creak of a tree branch, every gust of wind, sent a jolt through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Dylan," Maria called out, her voice tight. "You need to see this." I hurried over to where she stood, about 10 feet from the campsite. She was staring at a tree trunk, her face pale. When I followed her gaze, my stomach turned. Clear marks, for deep gouges carved into the bark, as if something massive had raked its claws across the tree. But the edges were too clean, too precise. These weren't the random scratches of an animal. They looked deliberate, calculated, like someone or something had marked the tree with purpose. "What the hell?" I muttered, reaching out to touch the marks. The wood was splintered and raw, the cuts fresh. "This doesn't make sense." Maria crossed her arms, her breath visible in the cold air. "You think this has something to do with the hikers?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to say what I was thinking, that someone might be playing games with us, that whoever, or whatever, had done this was still out here, watching, waiting. We regrouped at the tent, the silence between us heavy. The light was fading, and the snowfall was picking up, thick flakes sticking to our jackets. We didn't have much daylight left, but leaving now felt like a betrayal of the hikers we were here to save. And yet, staying too long could mean risking our own lives. "Let's wad this and move on," I finally said, my voice strained. "We'll circle back tomorrow if we don't find anything else." Maria nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. As we packed up and started back on the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple rescue mission. Something dark. Something dangerous. As the snow began to fall harder, the canyon seemed to close in around us, its walls towering like silent sentinels. The campsite faded from view, swallowed by the wilderness. But the image of that slashed tent, those claw marks, stayed with me, burned into my mind. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything changed. The moment the shadows in the canyon stopped being just shadows. In the moment, I realized we weren't alone. The canyon felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Not alive like the deer bounding across a meadow or the chipmunk skittering through brush, but something deeper, ancient, patient, and watching. Every crunch of our boots on the snow-covered trail sounded louder than it should have, swallowed by the towering walls of black rock around us. Maria was ahead of me, her headlamp bobbing as she carefully navigated the narrow trail. The wind had picked up, tugging at the edges of my jacket and howling through the crevices in the rock like a mournful ghost. The sheer drops on either side of the path made my stomach churn if I looked down too long. "Trail's getting worse," Maria called back over her shoulder. "No way they'd have come this far in the dark." Her voice carried a certainty that felt misplaced. I wasn't so sure. The boot prints we'd been following were faint but present, until now. Just ahead, they seemed to stop abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. I crouched to inspect the ground, my fingers brushing the icy dirt. The prints weren't just faint, they were smeared, as if someone had deliberately tried to obscure them. "Dylan?" Maria sounded impatient. "Something's off," I muttered. "Yeah, no kidding," she shot back. "It's called a snowstorm." But it wasn't just the snow or the biting wind gnawing at my nerves. There was something deliberate about the way those prints ended, as if whoever left them wanted to vanish. I stood and scanned the surrounding area with my flashlight. The beam caught jagged rock formations, tangled roots clawing their way out of the ground, and the endless void of the canyon. Shadows played tricks on my eyes, shifting as the light moved, but something in my gut twisted when I noticed a low-hanging branch snapped clean off. It wasn't the kind of break you'd see from an animal or the wind. This was precise. "We should keep moving," Maria said, her tone edging on exasperation. "We're burning daylight." But my feet didn't budge. "Look at this." I pointed to the branch, my flashlight illuminating the clean cut. "Does that look natural to you?" Maria sighed, stepping closer to inspect it. "Okay, it's weird." "So what?" "Maybe they tried to mark the trail. Then why break it so low to the ground? You'd want it higher, easier to spot," I countered. She didn't have an answer for that, and her silence only deepened the unease settling in my chest. We pressed on, the trail winding tighter and narrower. The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying a sound I couldn't place, a faint, almost melodic hum, like someone singing just out of earshot. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Maria paused, her head tilted, listening. The hum stopped. She turned to me, Her brow furrowed. You're imagining things. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't press it. We kept moving, but every step felt heavier, like the canyon itself was trying to hold us back. Then we saw it. A cairn, a small pile of rocks, stacked neatly on the side of the trail. Trail Marta? Maria asked, but her voice was uncertain now. Maybe, I said, though my gut told me otherwise. I crouched beside it, scanning the ground. The snow was disturbed here, but not like the rest of the trail. It was almost intentional. Someone had been here, recently enough to leave this behind, but there were no footprints leading away. How the hell? Maria trailed off. I didn't answer. My flashlight caught something else. Another pile of rocks, this one just a few feet off the trail, partially hidden behind a scrubby bush. It wasn't neat like the first cairn. This one looked hastily made, the stones barely balanced. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. Sticking out from under the rocks was a scrap of fabric, bright red against the snow. Dylan? Maria's voice was sharp now. I reached down, my fingers brushing the icy fabric. It was stiff and torn, but unmistakably part of a jacket. My stomach sank. The hikers had been here, but something about the way this was left felt wrong, like a warning. Maria knelt beside me, her flashlight scanning the area. What the hell is going on here? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the canyon felt different now. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, and the hum I thought I'd imagined was back, faint and insistent, just beyond the edge of hearing. Maria stood abruptly. We should turn back. Mark this spot and come back with a full team in the morning. No, I said, more forcefully than I intended. They're out there, and we don't have time. If we wait, we might be recovering bodies instead of rescuing them. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the dark void around us. Fine, but we need to move fast. I don't like this. Neither did I. We pressed on, the trail narrowing further, the walls of the canyon closing in around us. The cairn stopped, but the sense of being watched didn't. Every crunch of snow, every shift of the wind felt like a whisper. I kept my flashlight trained ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't ahead of us. It was behind. I didn't look back. Not yet. The cold air bit at my face as the sun dipped behind the canyon's jagged walls, painting the sky in deep strokes of purple and orange. The wind funneled through the narrow gorge, carrying with it an eerie whistle that seemed to echo endlessly. Maria was busy setting up our small camp for the night, her movements brisk and methodical. She always kept herself busy. It was her way of managing fear. I envied her for that. For me, the weight of the day hung heavy. The broken branches, the scattered belongings, the tracks that disappeared too conveniently. None of it sat right with me. I'd seen hikers make mistakes, seen nature claim its dues. But this was different. I didn't tell Maria, but deep down, I was starting to feel like someone, or something, was ahead of us, always just out of reach. Watching. After a dinner of freeze-dried stew and lukewarm coffee, I sat on a rock, staring out at the darkening canyon. Shadows stretched long and deep, swallowing the jagged cliffs until they seemed to merge with the void. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional crack of shifting rock or the far-off call of an unseen bird. Maria's voice broke my reverie. Dylan, you're brewing again. She was crouched by the fire, stirring the embers with a stick. Her face was half lit by the flames, making her look like a ghostly specter. I'm thinking, I replied, keeping my voice low. About the hikers? I nodded. And the campsite? The slash tent? It doesn't add up. People don't do that to their own shelter, especially out here. Maria shrugged, her shoulders heavy with the weight of her own doubts. Maybe an animal got to them. A bear, a cougar. It's not unheard of. No tracks, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. No claw marks, no scat. If it was an animal, it was the cleanest one I've ever seen. She didn't respond. Instead, she tossed the stick into the fire and sipped herself into her sleeping bag. We'll figure it out tomorrow. Get some rest. But I couldn't. Something about the night felt alive, charged. I kept my flashlight close, scanning the edges of our camp every few minutes. The wind carried strange noises, rustling, faint scraping, whispers of movement just beyond the firelight. My rational mind told me it was just the wind playing tricks, but my gut told me otherwise. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a branch swaying in the wind or a rock formation casting an odd silhouette. But it moved, and not with the chaotic randomness of nature. It was deliberate, purposeful. A figure, barely visible against the dark rock, standing perfectly still on the ridge about 50 feet away. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person. Whoever they weren't carrying a flashlight or wearing any reflective gear. They shouldn't have been able to see us from that distance, but somehow I felt their gaze locked onto me. Maria, I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. She was asleep, her steady breathing a stark contrast to the thundering of my heart. I stood slowly, careful not to make noise, and grabbed my flashlight. I shone the beam toward the ridge, my hand shaking slightly. The light cut through the darkness, but the figure didn't flinch or move. It stood there, unyielding, like a statue carved from the canyon itself. Pally! I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. This is a restricted area. Identify yourself. Nothing. I stepped closer to the edge of the camp, still training the light on the figure. My fingers hovered over the radio clip to my vest, but I hesitated. What would I even say? And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure melted into the shadows. No sudden movements, no sound. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, like a whisper carried away by the wind. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I kept the flashlight pointed at the ridge for a long time, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The ridge was empty, as if it had never been there at all. Dylan? Maria's groggy voice cut through the silence. I turned to see her sitting up, her face pale in the firelight. What's going on? I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. Nothing, I lied. Probably just my imagination. But it wasn't. I knew what I saw. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just watching. It was waiting. And it was only a matter of time before it made its move. The wind howled through the canyon like a restless spirit, tearing at my jacket and sending chills deep into my bones. Maria and I pressed forward, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound competing with the storm's mournful wail. My flashlight beam danced across the jagged rocks, the faint tracks we'd been following barely visible under the fresh dusting of snow. I knew we were close. I could feel it, though I didn't dare say it aloud. The last footprint we'd seen had led us to a narrow crevice that sloped steeply downward. It wasn't a place anyone would go willingly. Maria was silent behind me, her usual sharp commentary dulled by exhaustion and the weight of what we'd already seen. I stole a glance back at her. She was pale, her jaw tight, but her grip on the climbing rope was steady. "Ready?" I asked, my voice barely carrying over the wind. She nodded, and I began the descent, testing each step on the icy rock. The crevice closed in around me, its walls slick with frost and shadow. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt, like the canyon itself was trying to crush me. Then I smelled it. A faint, metallic tang that I recognized instantly. Blood. "Maria!" I called up, my voice sharp. "I think I found something." Her head appeared above the lip of the crevice, her flashlight sweeping the narrow space. I turned back to the ground ahead, and my stomach twisted. There, wedged between two jagged rocks, was a man. He was barely recognizable as human. His face was ghostly pale, his lips cracked and blue. His body was twisted unnaturally, his legs pinned by the rocks, and his jacket was soaked with blood that had frozen into a macabre sheen. His eyes fluttered weakly, and I realized with a jolt of horror he was still alive. "Jesus," Maria muttered, scrambling down behind me. I knelt beside him, trying to assess the damage. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, and his hands trembled violently. His fingers clawed at the air, as if trying to grab something unseen. "Hey," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're here to help. Can you hear me?" His eyes rolled toward me, unfocused. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. I leaned in closer, and then I heard it, a faint, gasping whisper. "Shadows!" The word sent a shiver down my spine. "What shadows? Can you tell me what happened?" He coughed weakly, a wet, rattling sound that made my stomach churn. "It's in the shadows, watching. Who's watching?" Maria asked, her voice tight. She was fumbling with the first aid kit, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew it was too late. His breathing grew shallower, his body shuddering as if trying to fight off some invisible force. He gripped my wrist suddenly, his strength surprising for someone so close to death. His eyes bored into mine, filled with raw terror. "Don't let it take me." I opened my mouth to reassure him, but before I could speak, his grip slackened and his head lolled to the side. The final breath slipped from his lips, disappearing into the howling wind. For a moment, neither Maria nor I moved. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant roar of the storm. I looked down at his lifeless face, the fear frozen in his features, and felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. Maria broke the silence. "What the hell does that mean? Shadows? What was he talking about?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever had terrified this man enough to drive him into this hellish crevice was still out there. And now, it felt like it was watching us. "Let's get him out," I said, my voice hoarse. "We can't leave him here." Maria hesitated, then nodded. We worked quickly, securing his body with a rope and pulling him up to the surface. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed darker, every gust of wind carrying whispers I couldn't quite make out. When we finally hauled him out, the storm was picking up. The wind was so strong now that it stung my face, and visibility was dropping fast. Maria looked at me, her expression grim. "We need to go back," she said. "We've got to report this." I nodded, but my eyes drifted to the canyon below. Something had driven that man to his death. Something he'd been running from until his last breath. And now, we were alone in its territory. As we started back, dragging his lifeless body through the snow, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The shadows seemed to shift and move, and for the first time in my life, I truly felt the canyon wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it didn't want us there. The air in the canyon was thick with silence, broken only by the distant howling of the wind. I had always found comfort in the solitude of this place, but tonight, that same solitude felt suffocating. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind carrying whispers I couldn't quite catch. Maria's voice crackled faintly over the radio, barely cutting through the static. "Dylan, are you sure about this? That ledge looks unstable." "I'm not leaving him here," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. I glanced down at the crumpled figure wedged between the rocks below me. The hiker's face was pale, his breath shallow and erratic. He wouldn't last much longer, and every second wasted was a step closer to losing him entirely. I anchored the rope to a nearby tree, testing its strength. "Hold the line steady. I'll be quick." The descent was slow and painstaking. The canyon walls loomed over me, jagged and menacing, as if they might collapse at any moment. My gloves scraped against the coarse rock, and the icy wind stung my face, but I forced myself to focus. Step by step, I inched closer to the hiker. When I finally reached him, I crouched beside his broken body. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, but he mumbled something under his breath. I leaned in closer. They're in the shadows," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Watching, waiting. A chill ran down my spine. His words were slurred, disjointed, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. I tried to steady my nerves. "You're safe now." "I've got you," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed in myself. I secured him to the harness and signaled Maria to pull us up. The rope tightened, and I began the slow climb back, keeping a firm grip on the hiker. The weight of him was heavier than I'd expected, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I hauled us upward. Halfway up, the rope jerked violently, and I froze. "Maria? What the hell was that?" Her voice came through, panicked. "I don't know. Something's wrong with the line." Before I could respond, the rope slackened, and I felt myself drop a few feet. My heart leapt into my throat as I clung to the hiker and the rope. Above me, the tree I'd anchored swayed unnaturally, as if something, or someone, was tampering with it. "Hold it steady," I shouted, my voice echoing through the canyon. "I'm trying." Maria's reply was frantic, but there was a new urgency in her tone. "Dylan, someone's here." I saw. Her voice cut out, and my stomach dropped. The radio was dead. I glanced up, straining my eyes against the dim light. Movement. A shadow darted across the ridge, too quick and too deliberate to be the wind. My pulse raced as I tried to process what I'd just seen, or thought I'd seen. Another violent jerk snapped my attention back to the rope. The anchor point was unraveling, the fibers fraying as if they were being cut. Panic surged through me as I clutched at the rope, my fingers slipping against the frozen material. "Maria!" I shouted, but there was no response. The tree above gave a groan, and I realized I had seconds, maybe less, before the anchor gave way entirely. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I pushed the hiker upward, hooking his harness to a nearby outcropping to secure him. My own grip faltered as the rope gave a final lurch, and then it snapped. I fell. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing but the rush of air and the jagged maw of the canyon below. instinct took over, and I grabbed wildly at the rock face, my gloved fingers finding a small ledge. Pain shot through my arm as my body slammed against the wall, but I held on, gasping for breath. Above me, the shadow reappeared, silhouetted against the moonlight. This time, I was certain it was a person. They stood motionless for a moment, watching me dangle helplessly. Then, as if satisfied, they turned and disappeared into the night. The wind howled around me as I clung to the ledge, my heart pounding. Whoever, or whatever, that was, they had cut the rope. They had tried to kill me, and they had done it without hesitation. "Maria," I croaked into the dead radio, though I knew it was useless. Summoning every ounce of strength, I began to climb. The jagged rocks tore at my gloves, and my injured arm throbbed with every movement, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The hiker was still up there, vulnerable, and Maria, God, I hoped she was still safe. When I finally hauled myself over the edge, gasping and trembling, the hiker was still where I had left him. But Maria was gone. The only sound was the wind, carrying with it an eerie silence that seemed to mock my every breath. I scanned the ridge, searching for any sign of her or the shadowy figure, but the darkness swallowed everything. For the first time in my career, I felt truly helpless. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with us yet. The wind had picked up again, a howling force that ripped through the canyon, carrying with it a stinging bite of snow. Maria and I trudged through the narrow path, our boots crunching over a layer of ice that was steadily thickening. The abandoned campsite and the bloody tent were still fresh in my mind, an ominous sign that we weren't just dealing with a missing persons case. Something, or someone, was out here, and they weren't just lost. Maria walked ahead, her flashlight beam bouncing off the jagged walls of the canyon. I lagged behind, scanning every shadow, every crevice in the rock. Paranoia? Maybe. But there was something about the way the trail markers had been shifted earlier. It was too deliberate, too precise. Someone wanted us off course. "Chillin'!" Maria's voice broke through the wind. She was standing still, her light fixed on the ground. I hurried to her side, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What is it?" I asked, my breath visible in the freezing air. She didn't answer right away, just crouched down and pointed. I followed the beam of her flashlight to a partially buried object in the snow. A glint of metal caught my eye. I knelt beside her and brushed away the icy layer with gloved hands. What emerged sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a knife. A heavy, hunting-style blade, its handle worn but sturdy. It had been left here deliberately, almost like a breadcrumb. "Why would someone leave this?" Maria asked, her voice tight with unease. I turned it over in my hands. The blade was nicked and scratched, the kind of damage that only years of hard use could cause. The handle was carved with initials, J, P. Recognition hit me like a punch to the gut. Those initials matched a name I'd heard in the park's darker stories, the kind that rangers swapped late at night over too many beers. Jacob Pratt. Pratt was a name that had been whispered in connection with disappearances in remote parks, though nothing had ever been proven. He was a ghost, an enigma, the kind of person who could disappear into the wilderness and stay there indefinitely, surviving off the land like a predator. Maria must have noticed a change in my expression. "Dylan, do you know something about this?" I hesitated. It might belong to someone I've heard of. A fugitive. He's been linked to cases like this." Her eyes widened. "You're telling me there's a murderer out here?" "I don't know," I said, though the weight of the knife in my hand felt like an answer. But this wasn't dropped by accident. Someone left it for us to find. Maria stood abruptly, her light swinging wildly across the canyon walls. We need to get out of here. Now! I didn't blame her for the fear in her voice. It mirrored the unease gnawing at my own resolve. But there was no way out, not tonight. The storm was too close, and the path back was already treacherous. No, I said firmly. We keep moving. We're close to their last known location. If we don't find them now, they won't survive the night. She didn't argue, though I could see the tension in her jaw. I slipped the knife into my pack, feeling its weight like a leaden promise. As we pressed on, the walls of the canyon seemed to close in tighter, the wind growing louder, almost taunting. Every sound felt amplified, the crunch of snow, the distant crack of ice, the mournful wail of the wind. But there was something else too, a faint, rhythmic noise, like a soft tapping. Maria heard it too. She froze mid-step, her head caught to the side. Did you hear that? I nodded, motioning for her to turn off her flashlight. The sudden darkness was disorienting, but it sharpened my other senses. The tapping continued, closer now. It wasn't natural. It was deliberate, like someone was striking a rock with a stick or the butt of a knife. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the shadows. There was no movement, but the sound persisted, echoing off the canyon walls. Dylan, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. I know, I whispered back. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so profound it felt oppressive. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, in the distance, a shadow shifted, not a trick of the light, but a figure, unmistakably human. I reached for my radio, even though I knew it was useless in the storm. The figure lingered for just a moment, then disappeared behind a rock outcropping. Maria grabbed my arm, her grip like iron. We need to leave, she hissed. I nodded, finally conceding. We turned back toward the path we'd come from, the knife in my pack feeling heavier with every step. As we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The storm hit hard that night, but it wasn't the snow or the wind that kept me awake. It was the sound of that tapping, echoing in my mind like a warning or a threat, and the nagging thought that the canyon wasn't the only thing trying to kill us. The storm was picking up, a low growl in the distance that promised chaos if we didn't move quickly. My boots crunched through the frost-covered ground as Maria and I pressed deeper into the canyon. The air felt heavier here, as if the walls themselves were closing in, watching us with a silent, ancient judgment. I hate this place, Maria muttered behind me. Her voice carried a nervous edge I hadn't heard before. She was usually the steady one, the voice of reason when my gut told me to take risks. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Something about this stretch of trail demanded silence. Even our radios, normally a source of comfort, were dead, just started crackling in my ear like ghostly whispers. We came across a patch of ground where the snow had been disturbed, scattered in erratic patterns. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but the longer I looked, the more it didn't sit right. There was no rhythm to the tracks, no clear direction. It was chaos frozen in place. Maria knelt beside them, her breath visible in the frigid air. Boot prints, she said quietly, tracing the outline of one with her gloved hand. But they're all over the place, like they were running in circles, waiting for something. The thought clawed its way into my mind before I could stop it. I swallowed hard and glanced up at the towering walls of the canyon. Shadows danced along the cliffs, as the sky darkened. It was just the wind and the shifting clouds, but it felt like the canyon itself was alive, watching, waiting. "We are close," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Maria looked at me, her brow furrowed. "Close to what, exactly? Finding them, or finding whatever scared them off?" I didn't answer. A few minutes later, we stumbled upon the next piece of the puzzle, a tattered jacket snagged on a low branch. The bright orange fabric was torn, slashed clean through as though by a knife or claws. Maria held it up, turning it in her hands. "This is bad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, stepping closer. "But look, there's no blood. If they lost it here, they might have kept moving. Maybe we're not too late." She didn't look convinced, and I didn't blame her. Every step deeper into the canyon felt like stepping into another world, one where the rules of nature didn't apply. We kept moving, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing minute. The trail was barely a trail anymore, just a narrow strip of snow-covered rock with a sheer drop on one side and jagged cliffs on the other. Then we sighed. A pile of scattered belongings lay just off the trail. A water bottle, a torn sleeping bag, a single hiking boot tipped on its side. They were covered in a thin layer of frost, abandoned like offerings to the canyon. Maria stopped dead in her tracks. This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched beside the items, examining them one by one. The boot was scuffed, the sole worn almost smooth. The water bottle was dented, its cap cracked. But it was the sleeping bag that caught my attention. There were marks long, parallel slashes, as if something or someone had torn into it with deliberate force. "Dylan," Maria said, her voice low, "we need to get out of here." "Not yet," I said, though I felt the same instinct tugging at me. "We are close. I can feel it." Maria didn't argue, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She was scared, and so was I. But something kept pulling me forward, some invisible thread that refused to let me turn back. As we moved past the scattered belongings, the wind picked up, howling through the canyon like a living thing. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, and for a moment, I thought I heard something beneath it, a faint, distant cry. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Maria shook her head, but she looked pale. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, but the sound was gone, swallowed by the wind. "Nothing," I muttered. "Probably just the wind." But I didn't believe that. Not for a second. We pressed on, every step heavier than the last. The trail twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the canyon's shadowed heart. And as the storm clouds gathered above, blotting out what little light remained, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The canyon was holding its breath, waiting for something. And so was I. The air in the canyon had shifted. The snowstorm was closing in, and with every gust of wind, the temperature seemed to drop another degree. Maria and I trudged forward, our boots crunching through the frost-coated ground. The terrain was unforgiving. Jagged rocks jutted out at unnatural angles, and the narrow trail seemed to mock our every step. But something else weighed heavier than the physical strain, the undeniable sense that we were not alone. Ahead, a rock overhang loomed, casting long shadows that danced with the dim light filtering through the storm clouds. It looked like a natural shelter, a place someone might seek refuge. I motioned to Maria, who nodded silently, her usual confidence replaced with a wary tension. We approached slowly, the crunch of our boots muted by the wind. As we rounded the corner, my heart sank. Beneath the overhang lay the crumpled form of a body, partially covered in snow. It was one of the missing hikers, a man in his late 20s, his bright orange jacket now a muted, icy hue. His limbs were splayed awkwardly, as if he had been thrown there rather than having fallen naturally. His face was frozen in an expression of terror, his eyes wide and glassy, staring at nothing. Maria inhaled sharply, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind through the rocks. I forced myself to step closer, crouching down to examine him. The snow had preserved him well enough to see the details. The deep gashes on his arms, as though he tried to fend off an attacker. His hands were raw, his fingernails cracked and broken, caked with dirt and blood. "He fought?" I muttered, my voice barely audible over the storm. Maria now beside me, her gloved hand trembling slightly as she pointed to the nearby rock face. "Dylan, look!" I followed her gaze and felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The rock was scarred with deep, parallel grooves, as if something or someone had clawed at it with a ferocity that defied explanation. The marks were jagged, uneven, and too large to be made by any animal native to the park. They led down the slope, disappearing into the canyon's depths. "Do you think?" Maria's voice trailed off, and I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't want to voice the fear we both shared. "I don't know," I said, standing up and scanning the area. My hand rested instinctively on the grip of my sidearm. The overhang provided shelter, but it also felt like a trap. The wind howled louder now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Maria moved to examine the body more closely, her professional demeanor taking over. "He's been dead for a while. Days, maybe," she said. "But these injuries, they don't make sense. This isn't from a fall. Someone did this." Her words hung in the air like a physical weight. I looked at the man's face again, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like his wide, unblinking eyes were trying to tell me something, to warn me. "What the hell happened to you?" I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. Maria stood and turned toward the rock face, her breath visible in the freezing air. "Dylan, do you see those footprints?" I followed her pointing finger to a patch of disturbed snow near the grooves. They were faint, partially obscured by the storm, but they were unmistakably human and recent. My stomach twisted. Whoever had made those marks was still out here. "We need to move," I said, the urgency in my voice surprising even me. "We can't stay here." Maria didn't argue. We began to back away, leaving the body beneath the overhang. I hated leading him there, but there was nothing more we could do. The storm was worsening, and the temperature was dropping fast. Survival had to come first. As we started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the canyon itself was alive, that it was watching us, waiting. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. I forced myself to focus on the path ahead, but my mind kept returning to the grooves on the rock and the terrified expression frozen on the hiker's face. Halfway down the trail, Maria stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" I froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the howl of the wind. Then, faintly, a sound emerged. It was distant and low, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down my spine. It sounded like a moan, long, drawn out, and filled with pain. "Is someone out there?" Maria called into the void, her voice trembling. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whatever, or whoever was making it had heard us. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that seemed to pull the air from my lungs. "We need to go," I said, gripping Maria's arm. "Now!" We quickened our pace, nearly slipping on the icy trail. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, emerging from the shadows. But the trail behind us remained empty, the only evidence of our encounter the tracks we left in the snow. When we finally reached a safer section of the trail, I stopped to catch my breath. Maria looked at me, her face pale and drawn. "Dylan, this isn't normal." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's out here, it's not done with us yet." I glanced back toward the overhang one last time, but it was shrouded in swirling snow. The hiker's lifeless eyes lingered in my mind, a silent witness to something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. We moved on, the storm closing in around us, and the canyon swallowed the overhang whole, leaving nothing but its secrets in the shadows. The wind was a howling beast, clawing at us as we struggled up the icy trail. Each step felt like a gamble, the snow-slicked rocks threatening to betray us at any moment. Maria was ahead of me, her boots crunching against the snow with deliberate force. I could see her breath flooding the air, ragged and quick. The storm was coming in fast, swallowing the light and muffling sound, except for the eerie whistle of the canyon's wind. My mind kept returning to the last body we'd found, the claw marks etched into the cliffside near the hiker's broken form. Human hands couldn't have made those marks. Could they? I shook the thought away, trying to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "I don't like this," Maria said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Me neither," I admitted. "We're getting close to the rim. Just keep moving." She nodded, but there was a tremor in her movements now, a slight hesitation with each step. The air felt heavier, oppressive. I told myself it was just the storm, nothing more. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a blot of darkness against the swirling snow. A figure standing still, too still, on the ridge above us. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead, staring, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure Maria could hear it. "Maria," I whispered hoarsely, my voice barely escaping my lips. "What?" She turned back, following my gaze. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The figure didn't move either. It was tall, unnaturally tall, or maybe it only seemed that way because of the snow obscuring its edges. The way it stood there, silent and unyielding, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the weather. "Who's there?" I called, my voice firm despite the tremor in my chest. No answer. Maria reached for the radio clip to her vest, but I grabbed her wrist. "It's not going to work out here," I said. "What the hell is it, Dylan?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure. "But we're not sticking around to find out. Let's go." We turned and started moving again, faster this time. The figure didn't follow, not right away. But I could feel it watching us, its presence like a weight pressing against my back. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but the trail was too narrow, the risk of a misstep too high. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl, like the earth itself was groaning. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was primal, otherworldly, a sound that vibrated through my chest and made my legs feel like jelly. Maria cursed under her breath. "Dylan, it's coming!" I turned my head just in time to see the figure move. No, not move, lunge. It was impossibly fast, closing the distance between us with inhuman agility. I raised my flashlight, the beam cutting through the snow like a blade. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of it, pale, elongated lens, hollow eyes, and a face that didn't look right. It wasn't a face meant for this world. "Run!" I yelled, shoving Maria forward. We bolted, our boots slipping on the ice as we scrambled up the trail. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Behind us, the growling turned into a guttural scream, high-pitched and piercing. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The figure was on all fours now, bounding after us like a predator, its limbs too long and moving in a way that made my stomach churn. Ahead, the trail split into two paths, one leading upward to safety, the other down into the canyon's dark abyss. "Go left," I shouted, hoping Maria heard me. She didn't hesitate, veering left and practically throwing herself onto the steeper path. I followed, my legs burning as we climbed. The figure didn't slow. I could hear it behind us, its claws, or whatever they were, scraping against the rock. I didn't have time to think, only to react. I reached for the pistol holstered at my side, fumbling with the snap as my fingers shook. Pulling it free, I turned mid-stride and fired a single shot. The sound echoed through the canyon, momentarily drowning out the storm. The figure stopped, its head snapping to the side as if it was listening. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it retreated, disappearing into the snowstorm as if it had never been there. Maria and I didn't stop until we reached the rim. By the time we collapsed onto the frozen ground, gasping for air, the storm had fully engulfed us. The canyon below was a swirling void of white. "It's gone," Maria said, her voice trembling. "For now," I replied, gripping my pistol tightly. But I knew deep down it wasn't gone. Not really. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the canyon, waiting for its next chance to strike. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, thick flakes clinging to my jacket and stinging my cheeks. The canyon walls loomed around us, their jagged edges barely visible through the shifting curtain of white. Every step felt heavier, the cold biting into my bones as the wind howled like a mournful ghost. Maria walked ahead of me, her head down, the tension between us an unspoken weight. We both knew we were running out of time. "Up ahead," she called over her shoulder, her voice muffled by the storm. "There's something." She stopped suddenly, her words cut short. I quickened my pace, nearly slipping on the slick rock. When I caught up, I saw it too. A body. The last of the missing hikers lay sprawled near the edge of a sheer drop, half buried in snow. His face was frozen in a grimace of terror, eyes wide and staring at nothing. His hands were clawed, fingers still clutching the frozen earth as if he tried to hold on to something or escape from it. "Jesus," Maria whispered. She crouched beside the body, brushing away the snow with a gloved hand. "Looks like he fell. Or maybe something dragged him here." I didn't respond. My eyes were locked on the ground around him. The snow was disturbed, a chaotic mess of tracks leading to and from the cliff's edge. Boot prints, definitely his, but also something else. Deep gouges in the ground, like claw marks, trailed through the snow in jagged lines. I knelt down, tracing one of the marks with my gloved fingers. It was too large for any animal I knew of, and too irregular to be man-made. My stomach churned. "This isn't right," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. Maria stood, her face pale. What do you mean? I didn't have an answer. I only knew that everything about this felt wrong. The way the prints seemed to circle the body, the unnatural angles of the marks in the earth. It was like he'd been hunted. "We need to move," I said finally, standing. The storm was growing worse, and the shadows around us seemed to deepen, as if the canyon itself were closing in. Maria hesitated, her eyes darting between the body and the cliff's edge. "Shouldn't we know?" I cut her off. "We can't. Not here." She didn't argue. I think she felt it too, that oppressive weight pressing down on us, the sense that we weren't alone. We left the body where it lay, marking the location in our GPS before turning back toward the trail. The climb back was brutal. The wind screamed through the canyon, tearing at us with icy claws. The path was slick with snow and ice, every step a gamble. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us. But there was nothing, only the relentless storm and the endless shadows. And then I heard it, a low, guttural sound carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the storm itself, the way it echoed and moaned through the canyon. But then it came again, closer this time. Maria froze. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my hand instinctively going to the radio at my side. It was useless, of course. The storm had killed our signal hours ago. "We need to go." "Now," I said, my voice tight. We started moving again, faster this time. The trail twisted and turned, the cliffs rising higher around us. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, every muscle in my body screaming at me to keep going. The sound came again, louder, closer. A strange, almost human wail that sent a chill down my spine. "Dylan," Maria said, her voice trembling. "It's following us." I didn't respond. There was no point. We both knew it. We reached a narrow pass, the kind of path that makes you regret every light decision leading to this moment. On one side, a sheer rock face. On the other, a drop that disappeared into darkness. The snow had turned to ice here, slick and treacherous. Maria went first, inching her way along the ledge. I followed, every step deliberate, my breath fogging in the freezing air. Halfway across, I heard it again. The wail. This time, it was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that didn't belong here. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the storm. For a moment, I thought I saw movement. A shadow, too large to be a person, darting between the rocks. "Down!" I shouted, the word barely audible over the wind. "Maria, move!" She didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled across the pass, slipping and stumbling, the storm blinding us. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind us. When we finally reached the other side, I turned and fired a shot into the darkness. The sound echoed through the canyon, but the shadow was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. We didn't stop moving until we reached a wider trail, the storm easing just enough to let us catch our breath. Maria looked at me, her face pale and drawn. "What the hell was that?" she asked. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. All I knew was that we weren't alone in the canyon. And whatever was out there, it wasn't finished with us yet. The wind was a living thing that night, howling through the canyon with a voice like a wounded animal. It clawed at us, biting through every layer of clothing and cutting to the bone. Snow lashed my face, the sharp flakes stinging like needles. The storm had come on faster than we'd anticipated, turning the already perilous climb into a nightmare. Maria was ahead of me on the trail, her headlamp bobbing in the swirling whiteout. Her voice crackled in my earpiece, barely audible over the wind. "Dylan, I can't see the markers. Are we sure this is the right way?" I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The canyon seemed to shift and stretch in the storm, warping into something alien. Even the familiar rock formations felt hostile, their jagged edges looming like teeth in the darkness. "We have to keep moving," I finally said, forcing more confidence into my voice than I felt. "We'll hit the ridge soon." The ridge. Safety. At least that's what I told myself. Every step felt heavier than the last. My pack weighed down on me, the straps cutting into my shoulders as it tried to drag me backward. The incline was relentless, the snow underfoot giving way to patches of slick, icy rock. More than once my boots slipped, and I had to throw my weight forward to keep from tumbling down into the abyss. Maria paused ahead, her figure barely visible through the storm. "Dylan," she called, her voice trembling. "I feel like—" She hesitated. "What?" I snapped, sharper than I meant to. My nerves were frayed, and every second we lingered felt like a dare to the thing out there, whatever it was. "I feel like we're being followed," she finished, barely above a whisper. My gut twisted. I had felt it too. That sensation of eyes on me, prickling at the back of my neck. But every time I turned, there was nothing. Just the wind and the storm and the endless dark. "We'll be fine," I said, though the words tasted like a lie. Then we heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the wind, not the scrape of boots on rock, not the groan of snow-laden trees. It was a low, guttural growl, distant but distinct, rising above the storm like a warning. Maria froze, her headlamp beam swinging wildly across the trail. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I was too busy scanning the darkness, my gloved hand inching toward the holster at my side. The growl came again, closer this time, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. "We need to move." "Now," I said, my voice tight. Maria didn't argue. She turned and started up the trail, faster now, her breathing loud in the earpiece. I followed, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was out there. The trail narrowed, forcing us to hunt the rock face to our left. To our right was nothing but open air, a sheer drop into the canyon's black heart. The wind would putter here, threatening to tear us from the ledge. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night, moving parallel to us along the opposite ridge. It was fleeting, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, but it was enough to freeze me in my tracks. "Maria," I hissed. "Stop." She turned, her face pale in the dim light. "What?" "What is it?" I pointed across the gap, but the shadow was gone. Only the storm remained, swirling like a curtain drawn tight around us. "Nothing," I said, though my heart was pounding. "Keep going." The ridge was just ahead, marked by a faint glimmer of the reflective tape we placed during the ascent. Relief surged through me as we scrambled onto the flat expanse, away from the exposed ledge. But that relief was short-lived. As I turned to look back down the trail, I saw it again. Closer this time. A silhouette, unmistakably human, standing motionless in the snow. "Maria," I said, my voice barely audible. "Run." She didn't hesitate. We bolted across the ridge, the snow dragging in our boots. The wind roared in my ears, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I didn't look back. Not until we reached the tree line on the far side of the ridge, where the trail dipped into a sheltered grove. Only then did I risk a glance over my shoulder. The figure was gone, or maybe it had never been there at all. Maria leaned against a tree, gasping for breath. What was that? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the shadow had followed us, and it wasn't done. But we had survived the ridge. For now, that was enough. The storm had no mercy, and neither did the canyon. But as we pushed forward, one thought kept me moving. We were running from the storm. We were running from something far worse. The ranger station was suffocatingly quiet that night, the kind of silence that didn't bring peace, but rather an eerie awareness of everything left unsaid. I stared at the report in front of me, the words blurring together under the harsh yellow light of the desk lamp. 3 hikers, 3 bodies, an unknown assailant. The facts were there, plain and cold, but they didn't explain the weight sitting on my chest, the gnawing feeling that I had only scratched the surface of something far darker. Maria had gone home hours ago, her face pale and voice trembling as she muttered something about needing a stiff drink. She hadn't looked me in the eye when she left. I didn't blame her. We'd made it out of the canyon, but what we carried with us wasn't just exhaustion or frostbite. It was a question that neither of us dared to ask aloud. What had we really escaped from? The radio crackled intermittently, bursts of static filling the silence like whispers from a restless ghost. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside coated in a pristine layer of snow, its purity mocking the chaos we just endured. I stood up, the chair creaking beneath me, and walked to the window. The canyon loomed in the distance, its jagged edges silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Even from here, it seemed to breathe, a living entity waiting for its next victim. I couldn't stay in the station any longer. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. Grabbing my coat and flashlight, I stepped out into the biting cold. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to the canyon's edge, the path familiar yet foreign in the moonlit quiet. Every step felt like it carried me deeper into something unseen, something waiting. When I reached the overlook, the wind greeted me with an icy embrace, howling through the dark void below. I peered over the edge, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but revealing nothing except jagged rock and endless shadows. My breath hung in the air, ghostly and fleeting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I thought of the hikers, of their twisted, lifeless bodies, and the fear etched into their frozen faces. I thought of the shadowy figure, always watching, always just out of reach. And then, as if summoned by my thoughts, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. My pulse quickened, my grip tightening on the flashlight as I swung it in an arc around me. The beam illuminated only snow and stone, yet the feeling persisted, crawling up my spine like icy fingers. "Show yourself," I muttered under my breath, my voice swallowed by the wind. I wasn't sure who or what I was talking to. Maybe it was the figure, the one I'd seen more than once during the search. Or maybe it was the canyon itself, ancient and sentient, mocking me for daring to believe I could unravel its secrets. And then I saw it. Far below, deep in the canyon's shadowed belly, something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a ripple in the darkness, like a shadow detaching itself from the rock. My breath caught, and I leaned closer, my flashlight beam dancing over the jagged walls. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The way it shifted, fluid and unnatural, defied explanation. For a moment, I thought it might be a trick of the light, a hallucination born of exhaustion and fear. But then it moved again, this time more deliberately, more assuredly. It seemed to glance upward, as if it knew I was watching. My stomach twisted, and I stumbled back from the edge, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever it was, it didn't belong to the world I knew. It belonged to the canyon, to the shadows, to the secrets buried deep in its depths. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the wind biting at my face, my legs frozen in place. Slowly, the shadow dissolved back into the darkness, leaving only the endless abyss staring back at me. I wanted to believe it was over, that I could turn around and walk away, but I knew better. The canyon had taken 3 lives, but it wasn't done. It never would be. As I finally turned to leave, the wind carried a sound to me, a low, mournful whistle that almost sounded like laughter. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Some things are better left unseen, left to the abyss. Back at the station, I locked the door behind me and sank into the chair, the report still waiting on the desk. My pen hovered over the page, but the words wouldn't come. What was I supposed to write? That I had seen something impossible? That the canyon itself was alive? No one would believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed myself. Instead, I wrote the facts. 3 hikers. 3 bodies. A known assailant. But in the back of my mind, the canyon whispered its truth, a truth I would never escape.